This is Phil Copeman, and I'll be talking about truths and myths about automated vehicle safety. Starting out, automated vehicle safety is complicated because you have to sort out the truth, the myths, and the it's complicated kind of answers if you really want to understand what's going on with safety here. Companies say that they are safer than human drivers, but the truth is more complicated than that, and public trust has been eroding in recent years. So let's take a look at some of the truths, some of the myths, and some of the it's complicated kind of answers to really understand this topic. Areas we'll talk about include, are automated steering features safer even if they have human supervision? Are robotaxis safer than humans yet? And is that even the right question to be asking? Maybe there's a lot more to it than that. Hint, there is. We'll talk about some important misconceptions and other issues that still need attention. The idea that automated vehicles and autonomous vehicles will someday be safer than human drivers is a little different than where we are today. So we really need to understand where we are and where we might go and the things that are between us and getting to that rosy future where people can play board games in their car while it drives itself down the highway. Why is automated and autonomous vehicle safety so complicated? There are a lot of factors. There are public expectations. People expect superhuman safety performance from a machine far, far beyond what a human driver might do, and maybe that's not fair. Also, trust is too easily given. When you have a nice ride in a robotaxi and everything seems great, if there's a problem later on, you feel like your trust has been violated, and the backlash can be really significant for even one adverse event, despite many thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of miles of good performance. There are technical challenges. Machine learning is still a work in progress. How to make that safe is still something people are working on. But robotaxis and other vehicles with machine learning in them are out on public roads right now. Part of this is that a statistical approach is not necessarily compatible with high-severity rare events. When things are catastrophically bad but almost never happen, normal statistical approaches are not that well suited to reasoning and working with such situations. Perhaps the biggest thing is that there's a pervasive industry culture clash that still is getting worked out. Machine learning folks say 99% is a great result, and the right for machine learning, 99% is a great result. But safety is about 99.9999 and a bunch more nines depending on the situation, and those two things are fundamentally incompatible. So when you say we're going to use machine learning for safety, you have to have a story for how you're going to get that 99% accurate type of thing to actually be safe. Now, there are stories to be told for sure, but this is one of the reasons why this area is so difficult to match these two things up. Silicon Valley has a move fast and break things culture, and that's led to hype cycles followed by disappointment and general inflated expectations that can't really be met, and that's been making it harder for the public to trust in safety in this technology. The automotive industry, for its part, knows how to make cars that are reasonably safe, but they spend a lot of time blaming the driver for not mitigating equipment failures. So their idea is we can have equipment that's pretty good, but doesn't need to be perfect because the driver's there to clean up the mess. And when you put a computer in charge and take out the human driver, guess what? There's no driver to clean up the mess. And the messes tend to be very rare, obscure, unusual things, which is precisely the kind of thing machine learning is not great at. Finally, the regulators are very test-centric. They say, well, we're going to run a bunch of tests, and then that will put pressure on the automotive suppliers to do the right thing for safety. But they've been struggling with software safety for a couple decades now, and now the human driver who is in charge of cleaning up the messes in case the software made a mistake isn't there anymore. Now it's all software safety, and they're struggling with that situation. If you put these things together, it's no wonder that the industry is still maturing, and it's still going to be a while before we understand how safety for automated and autonomous vehicles is really going to turn out. If you look at the industry, they'll say safety is our number one priority. Safety is urgent, safety first always, safety drives us, a new bar for safety, and so on. The industry is aggressively selling safety. And that's great, because if this technology can really make the roads safer, that's a wonderful thing. But along the way, there had been a lot of adverse news. Back in 2018, Uber ATG had a testing fatality when they were out trying to get their autonomous robotaxi technology working. Loco Motors had a shuttle driver injury in 2022. Pony AI had a crash where no one was injured, but the crash was severe enough that their uncrewed test permit was revoked. EasyMile has had problems with phantom braking injuries in a couple years. Cruise and Waymo had a number of issues in San Francisco, stalling and clogging up traffic, blocking emergency responders, and a fire truck crash. And in 2023, Cruise had a pedestrian dragging injury that resulted in their testing permits being revoked and, for all practical purposes, an operational shutdown. There's been enough concerning news at this point that the public has started to have more hesitation about the technology. Public trust is eroding. Driver attitudes towards self-driving vehicles have gotten worse in the last 4 years. What we're here to talk about is what's going on beyond the headlines so that everyone can understand what trust we should and should not have in the companies and technologies. To begin that conversation, let's talk about the types of vehicle automation. Now, you might have heard about the infamous SAE levels, and we're not going to use those. And the reason we're not going to is that they may be useful for engineers, but they're really confusing for trying to understand to the public and trying to understand regulations and trying to understand safety outcomes. Instead, we're going to look at the role of the driver, whereas the SAE levels look at the role of technology. In the role of the driver, there are 4 roles the driver can play. The first is driver assistance. The person drives and the car helps. Conventional vehicles look like this. Your hands are on the wheel, you're actually steering. The car might momentarily help you avoid a crash, but you're in charge and you're actually controlling the vehicle. The next mode is supervised automation. The car mostly drives, but the person helps. Lane centering technology is the dividing line between supervised automation and driver assistance. If the car is actually controlling the steering on a sustained basis, it's supervised automation. Now, the driver still has to pay attention, and despite the icon, there still might be a requirement for the driver's hands to be on the wheel. But the point is that the car is actually doing the driving, and the person is supervising the safety and helping when needed. The third mode is autonomous. The car does all of the driving. There may be nobody in it. The passenger may be asleep in the back seat. That's all fine. This is a robotaxi type technology where the car is fully autonomous, including not only driving, but all the other things that have to happen to make a car safe on the road. The fourth category is testing. And this is different than supervised automation because it is not the case the person's there just to help the technology. Yes, that's part of it, but the other part is the human driver is there to compensate for automation defects. When you're testing technology, the reason you're testing is there's a concern there might still be defects, and in practice, you expect probably there are still defects, and those defects can hurt or kill people. So doing testing is dramatically different than doing supervised automation, because the tester is there not only to fill in the gaps of the automation capability, but to also counteract potentially dangerous effects of an outright software defect that just does the wrong thing. With that understanding, let's dive into a series of truths and myths and learn more about what's really going on with this technology. Truth or myth? You can ride in an autonomous vehicle today. This one is true. You can actually ride in an autonomous vehicle today if you're in the right city. Waymo has deployed in Phoenix, San Francisco, Austin, and Los Angeles. Motional is operational in Las Vegas as this is recorded. And Cruise has previously operated in some cities, although they're currently paused. This will likely change over time. There'll be other companies entering the market. There'll be other cities. But the point is, right now, as this is being recorded, you can hop into a robotaxi and have a drive that has nobody behind the steering wheel and nobody remotely steering the vehicle either. So this is a real technology in pilot and testing deployment on public roads. There are other testings and deployments as well of other types of technology and other phases of development. Some vehicles are doing local parcel delivery and not intended to carry passengers at all. There's some low-speed shuttles, there's some full-size buses, and there's some middle-mile trucks doing parcel delivery, and so on. So this technology is definitely out on the road and operational, although company by company and route by route, how they're operating may be different. Sometimes it's fully autonomous, sometimes there's a local safety driver, sometimes there's a remote safety driver, and so on. The driver-out operations will vary over time. It depends on the company, depends on the operational concept. Not as much is known about what's going on with Chinese robotaxis, but the best available information, at least in English, is that the policy seemed to be for continuous remote safety supervision, at least for now. Remote operations have recently come to the fore as a consideration that previously had been overlooked. This happened when Cruise confirmed that its robotaxis relied on human assistance every 4 or 5 miles. Now, as it turns out, that headline isn't quite accurate. The details were that a robotaxi would ask for human help every 4 or 5 miles, but sometimes it would resolve the situation before the human help even had time to respond and solve the problem on its own. So it is not the case that humans are taking over the steering wheel every 4 or 5 miles. Because these remote assistance help requests were said to be for high-level guidance. Gee, what should I do? Not someone grabbing a remote steering wheel. Both Cruise and Waymo say they don't operate that way. And that's a good thing because remote steering is actually quite challenging. But remote operators play a part. And the question is that okay or not okay? How does that affect safety? Remote operators could have different roles. There could be someone doing remote driving, and some companies are trying to do this. That can have significant issues that if the driving commands are delayed or there's a sudden communication loss, what happens when the car is moving along and you lose the remote human driver or the human driver can't react in time. There can be a remote safety operator, someone who has a figurative big red button that can stop operations but is not responsible for steering. Or and both Cruise and Waymo say they're doing this. There's remote intervention that the robotaxi is on its own, but every once in a while it phones home for some help, which is very, very different than someone remotely continuously monitoring, having their hands on a steering wheel. So when you hear about remote operators, you have to ask, what do you mean by remote operation? Is it driving? Is it occasional hints and advice? What exactly is going on? Now, is that okay for safety? Well, if the remote interactions are infrequent and the vehicle is safe no matter what, but the remote intervention is to get it unstuck, maybe that's perfectly fine for safety. It depends on the specifics. But you also get into things like worrying about, well, if it gets stuck and it can't get help, is it impeding fire trucks? So things get complicated. But in principle, remote operation doesn't mean these are not autonomous. Remote operation does not mean they're unsafe. Remote operation can be part of a responsible deployment, but the details all matter. One of the questions you ask is, can a remote operator cause safety issues? If a remote operator is asked for an instant decision and they don't have enough context, they could make things worse instead of better. Nobody will be perfect, so the question is, how often is this going to happen? Hopefully it's a very low fraction of times, and the fewer times you ask for remote operations, the fewer chances there are to make a mistake. But you have to, on the other hand, ask, can lack of remote operator request also cause a safety issue? If the robotaxi is in trouble and it doesn't realize it and it doesn't know to call home, that can be a very dangerous situation compared to calling home and getting some advice. So the role of remote operators is complicated. It's not that well understood outside the industry. The industry doesn't talk about it much, but it's going to turn out to be important for long-term viability of deployments and for safety. There are a lot of open questions here, and we're going to have to see how this plays out. Wrapping up. Autonomous pilot deployments are already on public roads. Public road testing continues. If you want to take a ride in a robotaxi and you go to the right city and use the right company, you can definitely get a ride in an autonomous robotaxi today. Personally owned vehicles can drive themselves safely. Truth or myth? This one's a myth. While you can take a ride in a commercially owned fleet robotaxi, there are no personally owned vehicles that can drive themselves safely without continuous human driver oversight. Personal vehicles require supervision. Typically, a personal vehicle driving automation has two main parts. One is adaptive cruise control, which is controlling the speed, and the other is automated lane centering, which is controlling the position in the lane. Now, there may be other features on top of these, but these are the two basic features that are active for a vehicle to be in supervised automation mode. The driver plays a role in safety. There are limits to automation capabilities. Any vehicle on the road that you can own as an individual driver, even if it says names like autopilot or self-driving or full self-driving or whatever it says, those things are limited automation capabilities that require continuous human supervision to be safe. As an example of what happens when you're not continuously supervising, this is a crash that happened in 2018 where there was a vehicle that had this adaptive cruise control and automated lane centering activated. It was following another vehicle. The other vehicle cut out when it saw a fire truck, and the crash vehicle ran into the fire truck, and the person driving was apparently not paying enough attention because the person did not override the automation and hit the fire truck. There are so-called level 2 and level 2 plus systems according to the SA levels. Level 2 plus is not actually a valid name, but manufacturers want to use that to indicate they're somehow better than baseline level 2 systems. And within that, there are hands-on systems that notionally require you to have your hands on the steering wheel all the time, although the enforcement for that varies. There are also some hands-free systems. These let you take your hands off the steering wheel, but still require you to be paying attention to the road. All these systems require continuous driver attention to make up for shortcomings in the system design. For example, if it can't see fire trucks, it's the driver's responsibility to notice there's a fire truck in the way and take control of the vehicle to maneuver around it. We're also seeing the introduction of so-called level 3 systems. Now, in theory, those are supposed to be ones where you can take your eyes off the road and stop paying attention to the road until the vehicle tells you to pay attention. But in practice, the driver manuals have warnings saying that the driver is supposed to be attentive to road conditions, and it's not clear how you do that if you're not actually paying attention to the road. So as far as we know today, all these level 2 plus, level 3 systems all fall into the bin of supervised automation. The automation drives the vehicle down the road. It does steering, it does speed control. It has varying abilities to deal with other things that might happen. But in the final analysis, all of them require the driver to pay continuous attention to what's going on the road for safety. Now, what can go wrong? Well, things can go very wrong. We've known for decades there's a thing called automation complacency. The cycle is that drivers overtrust the automation. People are very quick to trust. A few minutes of driving, a few hours of driving, you say, this thing's really good. I'm going to trust it. And once you do that, it's very hard to keep your attention focused on the road. This is just how human beings are wired. Our attention is going to wander, and there's a huge temptation to stop monitoring, to engage in other tasks, to keep your mind occupied. Very, very difficult to remain focused on the road. What happens? Well, bad things can happen very quickly. This is an image from a vehicle in a fatal crash in Delray Beach in 2019. And in this fatal crash, you can see that there was a tractor trailer, and what happened was the car underran the tractor trailer, killing the driver. This is 1 second before impact. But in fact, the automation was engaged 9.9 seconds before the crash. So less than 10 seconds before the crash, the human driver was still in charge of the vehicle. It only took 10 seconds between the time the automation engaged and the fatality occurred. That's not a lot of time. So if you take your eyes off the road for even 10 seconds, you could end up dead. There was no human steering for 7.7 seconds. So it's very clear that the time between the person was driving and the time the fatality happened was extremely short. So people who think, I'll look up every 15 seconds or every minute to check in on it, are going to miss this kind of fatal situation. In this case, it was a truck crossing across the path of the automated vehicle. The truck entered the road during the 10 seconds between the time the automation was turned on and the crash happened, but it was only 10 seconds. Driver monitoring might help with this, but it's still a work in progress. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety recently evaluated 14 supervised automation systems, and they found out that only one was acceptable. The Lexus system was rated as acceptable overall. And the rest of them were marginal. There were 2 marginals, and the rest all failed. So there's still a lot of work to do to make sure that the driver remains engaged, which is critical for safety in these systems. The takeaway here is that automated steering requires continuous human attention from the driver and is not really self-driving. We've heard so many times people are inherently terrible drivers. Is that truth or is that a myth? Well, in here, it's kind of a misleading statement. The situation is complicated, but let's break that down. Definitely a myth is the statement that 94% of crashes are due to human error. The industry repeatedly says that, and it's a gross exaggeration and misrepresentation of the underlying data. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration used to even say that until they were called out on it. They have a publication saying 94% of serious crashes are due to human error. That's not really what's going on. If you look at the underlying data, also published by NHTSA, what it says is humans failed to prevent some crashes. That's different than causing the crashes. Let's look at the exact wording of the study from NHTSA that this is all based on. What it says is that critical reason was assigned to drivers in 94% of the time. And well, what's critical reason? Critical reason is the last thing that happened. So this is saying 94% of the time, maybe the human driver could have prevented a crash. It's not quite the same as saying they caused it. But if you look at the very next sentence in the same paragraph in that publication, we're talking about the very next sentence. What does it say? It says, in none of these cases was the assignment intended to blame the driver for causing the crash. So the underlying study from NHTSA says, no, they're not causing the crashes. It's just an involvement in human error. What's really going on is there are lots of possible contributions to crashes, and lots of times there's a bad situation where the human driver might possibly avoid a crash, not cause it, but might avoid it, and if they're not perfect in failing to avoid it, then they are blamed in part for the crash, and that's what the 94% is about. Mind you, no credit is given to the many, many, many times where human drivers see something wrong and do the right thing to avoid the crash. So this statistic says that yes, human driver skill plays a role in crashes, but it's not at all the same with the implication that, well, because human drivers are terrible, we should get rid of the human driver. That's just not so. But don't take it from me. Take it from the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board who said, it ain't 94%. The idea is that if you want to improve safety, blaming human drivers for being bad doesn't get you to better safety because there's so many different contributions beyond just human drivers being imperfect as humans are. The industry, nonetheless, has pushed on this to say, oh, humans are terrible drivers. 42,795 Americans were killed, implied because human drivers made mistakes. That's very far from what really happens. And human drivers drive drunk, and they just drive distracted and drowsy. And those are all true, but it's not 43,000 fatalities worth solely attributed to those causes. Therefore, you should use our robot drivers instead. The implication is that if we got rid of the humans and did the robots, we'd save 43,000 lives a year. The reality is far from that. One thing that position ignores is that human drivers can actually improve. So let's look at the data. People love to show the last 10 years of data, which show things flat and then a little bit worse with the COVID-19 pandemic. But if you zoom out and look back to 1985, in fact, cars have been getting safer just with human drivers. The fatality rate has gone down to 60% of what it used to be. The injury rate per mile has gone down to 47% of what it used to be. And the fatality per population has gone down to 67% of what it used to be. Now, I'd love to see these numbers better, but saying there's nothing you can do except call in the robots because humans are impossible to improve is just not true. Here's the data showing that a combination of driver behavior changes and better technology has in fact reduced road fatalities. Would we like it to be better? Absolutely. But you can't say there's nothing we can do except call in the robots. In fact, if you want to improve safety, there's a lot of different things you have to work on, and it's more than just those allegedly terrible human drivers. The next obvious question is, okay, we improved, but we'd like to improve a lot more. Could we have done better? The answer is, yeah, we could have, but let's look at some numbers to back that up. In 1985, alcohol played a role in 41% of fatalities. That's a serious problem that needed to be addressed. And in 1985, the fatality rate was 2.5 fatalities per 100 million vehicle miles traveled, which is a pretty high number. So how did that change? Well, by 2019, Alcohol-related fatalities had gone down to 28%. Still a high number, but a marked improvement. Things are getting better there. And the fatality rate had cut to less than half, at 1.11 per 100 million vehicle miles. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic by 2021 had shot back up, but we know that human drivers are capable of 1.11 because that's what we saw in 2019. We can say, okay, we've gotten better. This is essentially a different way of looking at the data from the previous graph. But let's ask, gee, how do other countries do? Well, let's take the United Kingdom as a comparison country. In the United Kingdom in 1985, they had just finished a drink driving improvement program, and by 1985, they had only 18% of their fatalities due to alcohol. And their fatality rate was worse than the US at 2.67 per 100 million vehicle miles. Okay, well, how did they change in 2019? 2019, their drink driving rate was down to 13%, so a nice improvement, but they were already better than the US to begin with, and they still stayed at least twice as good as the US for that. How about their fatality rates? Their fatalities rates went down by a factor of 5 to 0.51, much, much better than the US. So they're at least twice as good as the US for fatalities. So the two takeaways. One is that it isn't all drunk driving. The second is you can do a whole lot better than the US has been doing. And it's not due to robot drivers because they weren't deployed in 2019 in enough numbers to make any difference at all. We can see the UK is one of the better countries, although Scandinavian countries do even better. But there are a whole bunch of countries that are better than the US. In fact, the US is objectively terrible in terms of fatalities per vehicle kilometers. So discussion saying, well, human driver is terrible, there's nothing you can do, is false because there's plenty you can do, and there's all these countries doing it. And it isn't just Europe. Australia is down there, Canada's down there. The United States is really lagging behind on highway safety. And it can't be attributed solely to humans being terrible drivers because there are human drivers in the other countries as well. The takeaway for this section is that better road safety does not require using computer drivers. You can do much better with human drivers by looking past blaming the human and looking at other factors that contribute to road safety. Let's consider whether computer-controlled active safety features can improve safety. Truth or myth? This one's true. Computer-controlled active safety features really do provide safety. Examples of some warning features are backup cameras and tire pressure monitors and rear cross traffic alert. Those are things that don't intervene, but rather tell the driver there's something dangerous going on so the driver can react. But there are also automated interventions in the form of electronic stability control, automatic or advanced emergency braking systems, and so on. AEB in particular has been shown to really reduce crashes, perhaps 50% front to rear crashes. So AEB really has safety benefits. Now it's important to note that this is a momentary system that when it detects an impending crash, it applies brakes to reduce the severity of crash or in some cases avoid the crash. Lane keeping assistance is another active safety system. So this is not continuous steering. Rather, lane keeping assistance is when you get to the edge of your lane, it sort of nudges you back into your lane, hopefully waking you up to the fact that you were drifting off the lane. So it's not automated steering, it's just a momentary intervention like the rest of these features. These things really help provide safety. What active safety does not include is sustained steering, lane centering. That's a different feature, a different discussion. But if we restrict ourselves to talking about momentary interventions, active safety systems really do improve safety. There's a nice website called My Car Does What, and it lists icons and descriptions, and there are a whole bunch more features beyond the ones I show here. And the idea is your car has a surprising number of capabilities if it's a new car to help warn you and to intervene to keep things safe. These features really work. They provide warnings or they provide momentary intervention. So wrapping up this section, computer-controlled features actually do improve safety as long as we're not talking about lane centering, which is not active safety. It's a different thing. Truth or myth? Automated steering improves driving safety. This one's a myth. Automated steering, lane centering assistance, does not actually improve driving safety. It's important to point out the difference between automated steering and active safety features. So an active safety feature might be lane departure warning, in which the driver gets a warning, hey, you're going out of your lane. Or it might be lane keeping assistance, where if you go to the lane boundary, it momentarily nudges you back in. But neither one of those actually keep your car in the lane on a continuous basis. They're just momentary safety interventions. Those provide value and improve safety. What does not improve safety is automated steering, which amounts to supervised automation. When you have automated steering, auto steer, lane centering, whatever it's called, that's sustained steering control. You're not steering anymore. The car's steering, and you're just keeping an eye on it. That makes it supervised automation. There have been plenty of claims that this improves safety, but the data does not support that conclusion. And the issue here is it's not really an assist anymore. It's actually steering. The driver is no longer continuously controlling the vehicle, and that is very likely and been known for decades to lead to driver dropout. It's hard to pay attention when the car is doing the steering instead of the human driver, and that's the big difference. And humans are not particularly good at watching boring automation tasks. Let's take a look at some data to understand how this really works. Here's some data from a manufacturer that has famously claimed that their auto steering feature makes things safer. And they'll release unadjusted data that mix highway miles and city miles and compare with their auto steer feature on versus off. The complication is that different driving areas have different safety outcomes. In particular, divided highway driving is a lot safer than undivided high-speed country road driving, for example, and city driving has different characteristics. If auto steer is only on for the easy miles, then that inflates the safety outcome compared to a look at human driver baselines. So Noah Goodall in 2021 published a paper saying, let's take a look at this data and let's adjust for the fact that the active safety features are also in these vehicles, which normal vehicles don't necessarily have, and the driver age and freeway versus other roads. Importantly, new vehicles have a lot of active safety features and old ones don't. So if you're comparing a brand new vehicle with a lot of active safety with a fleet average that mostly doesn't have it, the question is whether the benefit is coming from auto steer or is it really coming from active safety. When you do the adjustment, what you find out is that the auto steer on versus auto steer off doesn't really make much difference because the benefit, the vast majority of the benefit is coming from active safety, not from using auto steer. If you have active safety only, in some cases, it's better than with auto steer. In some cases, it's not. Although in early 2020, there were all sorts of weird things going on roads with the COVID pandemic, so it's hard to know what to make of that data. But the takeaway is saying, oh my goodness, if you put on auto steer, it makes the car way safer. They're just not true once you adjust for the variables involved. Right now, there's no data showing that automatic steering makes things safer, and there are situations in which it can make it more dangerous. It's not just that one paper. Recently, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, IHS, came out with a statement that very clearly says there's little evidence that partial automation has any safety benefits. And this is in the context of evaluating those auto steer type systems. So they also agree that, really we're not sure if it improves safety or not. The takeaway is that automated steering is a convenience feature, not a safety feature. Truth or myth? People are terrible at supervising automation. This one's true. People are terrible at supervising automation. We've known this for decades. And what's the root cause of this? Well, there's automation bias and complacency, and there's sort of a package of effects that all come together. Automation bias is when people tend to overtrust automated decision making. This isn't just about cars, this is everywhere. People have this feeling that, well, if the computer said it or the machine said it, I believe that more than I believe a person. Combine that with automation complacency, which is inattention to potential malfunctions. If you're driving along and the car goes mile after mile after mile steering itself on the road, or you're doing some other task and the computer gets it right and gets it right and gets it right, it's really hard to keep paying attention, and it's very easy, oh so easy to get distracted into something else, figuring, well, if something goes wrong, I'll notice. I can just check my emails. It'll be fine. I have one hand on the wheel. I'm looking at the road. It'll be fine. And it's not fine. What happens is that your response time degrades, your ability to notice things degrades. But this is not making you a bad person. It makes you a human. All humans have this issue. It can be compensated to some degree with training and monitoring, but it's an inherent human quality. So any designer that ignores the potential for automation complacency is basically denying your humanity as a user. This is what people do. They become complacent. And the challenge for safety is to design systems that even though that truth exists, they still remain safe. Another skill issue that we don't hear about as much, but is very much a thing in aviation, is skill degradation. If you turn on automation and rely on automation, you get less practice at the skill and you become worse at it. This can be a real issue if the only time you intervene is when there's a crisis and your skills are bad because you haven't been actually driving, the car's been driving for you, and then thousands of miles later, all of a sudden you need to be at your best possible driving performance with no notice and no practice. That's not going to turn out well. So these are the challenges for increasing the amount of automation in driving and still remaining safe. The National Transportation Safety Board has some recommendations. These came out of a crash in 2016, a fatality in Williston, Florida, where a car using automated steering underran a tractor trailer, killing the driver. And back in 2016, they said, there are two real issues here relevant to automation complacency. The first is that manufacturers should limit the use of automated vehicle control systems to the conditions for which they were designed. In this case, a contributing factor to the crash was the automation was designed for limited access highways with no cross traffic. The vehicle automation system was not able to see objects that were stationary in the line of travel. So that included both stop vehicles, but also vehicles crossing at a right angle. And in this case, a big rig was crossing at a right angle, so it had no motion compared to the pavement in the direction towards or away from the car. So the car didn't see it and hit it, and the driver wasn't paying attention. What NTSB says is you should have those systems turn themselves off and be unable to operate in roads where you know from maps that there is cross traffic. But this system doesn't do that, and that contributed to the crash. The other thing they said was that the system should be good at sensing the driver's level of engagement. If the driver's not paying attention, the system should at least warn the driver and perhaps turn themselves off. So NTSB says that you need to limit the conditions of operation to the ones they were designed for, and you need to have the driver's level of engagement monitored back in 2016. To understand what's going on here, let's look at one way in which the issue of improving automation can interact with people having trouble paying attention to good automation. The vertical axis is safety, so up is good, up is more safe. And the horizontal axis is how long it is between malfunctions. The first thing to note is that all the active safety systems have been improving safety. Things like automatic emergency braking have been improving safety. So baseline human drivers in a 12 or 20-year-old car have a certain level, but if you add the features on new cars that are available that would be available with or without driving automation, you actually improve the safety quite a bit. So if you look at the national average, it's down at the human driver's level, but if you look at a new car average, it's actually quite a bit higher. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at automated driving capability and safety. If you just turn on the automation and close your eyes and ignore what's going on, which is a really bad idea today, what you'll find out is safety is pretty poor. Now, what we hope is that over time, automated driving gets better. So the horizontal axis is also over time. We hope it gets better, but right now it's not better. So right now, there's no way you should be turning on these systems and not paying attention to the road. So people are paying attention to the road. The issue is that as the system acts pretty well most of the time, if you've gone 10 miles, 100 miles, 1,000 miles, and the system has never made an error, it's going to be very difficult to pay attention. So the human driver attention goes down. And if you look at the combination of potential driving mistakes made by the automation and the fact that the human drivers are going to have trouble paying attention, what you get is a net overall driving safety that is likely to go down over time for a while before it goes back up. This part of the middle I call the valley of degraded supervision. What you have is an automated driving system so good that it almost never makes a mistake, but a driver who overtrusts it. And so when a mistake does happen, you get safety outcomes worse than a human driver without any of the active safety. Now, there's another thing we should note, that we don't actually know whether these systems will ever be better than a human driver with active safety. If you put in automated driving, is that better or worse than a human driver just supported by active safety, which is also getting better year by year? We don't know the answer to that. The jury's still out. Right now, it seems likely they could at least be close, but we don't know if it will actually be better. So the issue here is making sure that you design a human interaction strategy that keeps you out of the valley of degraded supervision and gets you at least as safe as an average human driver, even if you've degraded beyond the active safety a little bit. The story the industry tells for how they plan to do this is better driver monitoring. Driver monitoring technology might be a steering wheel touch sensor, it might be a face and gaze camera, which is considered a better practice than just steering wheel touch sensors. It could be hand position sensor, maybe with a camera. There are a lot of ways to go about this. The idea is that you only get safety with these systems if the human driver is paying attention and ready to intervene. And you need more than just whether someone's applying torque to a steering wheel, because maybe they're using a steering wheel weight, to really establish that. So if you want safety with this automated driving technology, you need to be monitoring the human and making sure they pay attention, because driver dropout is what humans do. It's human nature, it will happen, so you need driver monitoring as a countermeasure. There's some challenges here. It has to work in the dark. Some driver cameras have infrared sensors so they can illuminate the driver's face at night, and some don't. Some cameras work with sunglasses, some don't. Some touch sensors work with gloves, some don't. And so you need to address all these things if you want to have a driver monitoring system that really works all the time when people are driving. There's also intentional misuse and abuse. Some people will cover the camera to enable the feature, or they'll use a wheel weight. You can try and shame the drivers in saying, well, they shouldn't do that, but people are going to do it. This is what people do. And so if you want a system that is safe not only for the driver, but for the other road users, your system has to detect these kinds of abuse and prevent operation when this abuse is taking place. You also have a challenge of determining mental state from a person's external feature. People are remarkably good at learning to fool these systems. There's the saying, the lights are on, but nobody's home. You can have your eyes open and your mind can be wandering. And so how well these systems will be able to diagnose those states is unclear. It's still a developing technology. We certainly hope that a combination of driver monitoring and improved driving automation quality will get us to be safer than human drivers, but we still don't know how it turns out. And what if monitoring shows drivers are unable to remain attentive? Now what do we do? I think that driver monitoring might be the wrong term for this. What you really need is driver attention management. Telling a driver that they're not paying attention isn't really what you need. What you need is to find human-computer interfaces to make sure the driver is paying attention when they need to, and the driver monitoring, of course, can play a key role in that. The takeaway is that driver attention management is an open challenge. We hope that it will improve safety to make automated driving with human interaction safe, but we're still on the road to get there. Ordinary drivers are qualified to test driving automation. Truth or myth? This one's a myth. Public road beta testing is a thing. It's happening in the US today. What is beta testing? Beta testing is operation in an intended environment of something that isn't quite ready to be released as a product. The expectation is that the software can and probably will have defects. If you were sure it didn't have defects, you wouldn't be testing, you'd be deploying. How does this play out in real vehicles? Well, if you look at the owner manual for a feature that's called full self-driving, even though we know that it requires operator oversight, the owner manual itself says that the feature may make mistakes that require immediate driver intervention. Now, the critical thing here is there's a difference between a mistake and normal intended operation. You might say, well, this particular feature is not intended to be able to see stop vehicles. And if the supervisor knows that this is the characteristic of the system and is appropriately attentive to the road, they know, okay, this thing's not supposed to detect fire trucks, so it's my responsibility to do fire trucks. But that's not a mistake. That's a limitation. And the important difference here, the difference between testing and supervision, is that this software might make outright mistakes. It might say, oh yeah, we're supposed to keep you in the lane, and then for no reason that the driver can tell whatsoever, it might just swerve you off the road due to a software defect. So mistakes mean there's a defect, and the owner's manual says they're there. That makes you a beta tester. Now the owner's manual also says, well, this is a beta feature. Okay, so this company expects ordinary retail customers to be testers of potentially dangerous technology. And what does it say in the release notes? In fact, the release notes say a compatible thing. They say it may do the wrong thing at the worst time. So this is not a fully mature product ready for deployment. This is in fact testing. And the testing is done by ordinary retail customers. So how does that stack up against typical industry practices? Well, not so well. The issue is that road testing of immature software can cause real harm. Now, the point of doing testing is to do safety validation, and safety validation asks two questions. The first question is, does it do the intended thing correctly? Okay, you're driving down the road, can it actually keep you in the lane correctly? But the other thing you do, especially for safety, is you ask the additional question, does it not have unsafe surprises? And the issue with road testing of beta software is the unsafe surprise part. This means that testers on public roads and other road users as well face the risk of dangerous misbehaviors of an immature software feature. Here's an example of how this goes wrong. There was a crash in the San Francisco Bay Bridge with multiple injuries caused by a beta feature being operated inside the tunnel. The beta feature steered the car left into the fast lane and then applied brakes, causing a pileup. Now, we can blame other drivers for not paying sufficient attention, etc., but they had no reason to believe that someone was testing immature software with defects inside a tunnel. For that matter, the driver wasn't trained as a tester either, as far as we know. He was just a retail customer. The accepted industry practice for on-road testing requires several steps. One is using simulations and a test track before road testing. So you want to have a prior expectation that the features work as advertised before you go out on public roads. You then need to have special training and tester qualification. So a typical discussion with an engineer at a car company involving road testing reveals that they had to go to a test track and undergo special training before they were allowed to take immature under-test software out on public roads. That opportunity is not afforded to normal retail customers who are buying a car, downloading beta software, and then going out and testing on public roads. In fact, driving around with a car isn't actually testing. If you're doing testing, you have a test plan, you have a set of procedures, and you ask questions like, okay, we think that a particular feature of software may have had a problem. Let's say it had a problem going down tunnels. And so what we're going to do is, with extreme caution, we're first going to go down empty tunnels. When that seems okay, we're going to go down tunnels with other traffic using a trained tester who's trained and practiced and has done multiple runs of emergency response drills so they know if something goes wrong, they can react. And by the way, if we notice anomalous behavior in a tunnel, we don't keep going through tunnels to see how often it misbehaves. We say, all right, our car has a problem in tunnels. We're going to avoid tunnels until we think we fixed the problem, and validated that with testing in simulation and a test track. So there's no reason to go back and prove over and over again that your car doesn't work. You should be avoiding situations where you know it doesn't work until you can fix them. So what we're seeing with end retail customer testing is there's no test plan, there's no avoidance of known defects. They're just driving around, waiting for something bad to happen and hoping they can avoid it. Release to public customers should only happen after safety validation is completed. You do not take experimental software and put it in the hands of an untrained customer who's just trying to buy a car to get them someplace. Retail customers should never be testing safety. That should be the manufacturer's job. The takeaway is that customers cosplaying as beta tester exposes everyone to undue risk. Blaming drivers deflects accountability away from companies. Truth or myth? This one's true. There's a concept called the moral crumple zone. A moral crumple zone strategy is the human operator is a system component, and one of their jobs is to bear the brunt of moral and legal responsibility if something goes wrong. Now you might say, okay, well, if there's a human driver in a car and the car is designed as well as it can be, and the driver makes a mistake, they should bear the brunt of the responsibility. Okay, that's fair enough. But what if the system is designed a little differently? What if the system follows the following pattern, which is unfortunately increasingly common? The manufacturer designs a system that they know is likely to be unsafe in practice. And it's a system that people will inevitably make mistakes using. It's not a matter of people misbehaving, but just nobody's perfect, and this system will cause harm if a person is ever imperfect. So they're putting unreasonable requirements on the human operator, but they're going to install a human operator anyway, and in essence, when the bad thing happens due to some defect in the system, they're going to blame the human operator for being less than superhumanly perfect. What do you get when you do that? Well, if that's your strategy, what you end up with is scrutiny is deflected from the defect, and the safety defect is not corrected because you can just say, oh, well, the human operator was supposed to be perfect. That human was imperfect. Therefore, the fact that the system had a dangerous malfunction and we told the user it was their job to fix it, well, imperfect people can't fix it all the time. Sounds like we have a human driver problem. The outcome of a moral crumple zone strategy is predictable harm done to the users or potentially other road users. And the issue is that any design that requires a human to be perfect is really asking people to be superhuman. And that's just an unrealistic expectation. You won't get safety that way. Here's an example of the moral crumple zone in action with an autonomous vehicle testing. In March 2018, Uber ATG had a fatality with their test program. They were running a bunch of robotaxis over and over and over again in the area of Phoenix, Arizona, and eventually a pedestrian was killed. The situation was complicated. There was pressure to test aggressively. The testers are going through long hours of vehicles that they said were throwing them around, doing lots of aggressive maneuvering, very uncomfortable, very tough on the drivers. Now, in this case, the driver who had the mishap was said to be distracted by a cell phone. Her side of the story is that there was a company cell phone that she was required to monitor, and that's what she was looking at. We're not going to try and litigate that here. The point is there are two sides to the story. Could the driver have been more attentive? Yeah, probably yes. Was the driver put in a no-win position? Arguably yes. Given the totality of the situation, it seems very likely that a fatality or severe injury was simply a matter of time, a matter of chance, which driver it happened to first. What happened as an outcome? Well, the operator faced a criminal trial. She did a plea deal to an undesignated felony, got probation, but she definitely was the one who bore the brunt of this mishap. Now, what happened to Uber? It's pretty clear that they did a lot of things that made it more likely such a mishap would happen. And there were plenty of things such as putting a second driver in, doing more aggressive driver monitoring, doing shorter shifts, giving better rest breaks. There are a bunch of things they might have done that could have avoided this mishap, but they didn't. What was their consequence? They faced no charges at all. They settled with the victim's family, and that was it. Now, to their credit, after the mishap, they got the message and they embarked on a safety path. From a legal point of view, the consequences they faced were quite minimal. Here's another story. This is about Tesla Autopilot having a double fatality. In December 2019, a Tesla driver was going 74 miles per hour and went through a red light at the end of a freeway. So the freeway ended, changed to city streets, and the car was still on autopilot, and apparently the human driver was not paying adequate attention. The driver was an off-duty limousine driver who had autopilot enabled. 2 people were killed in another vehicle who were crossing through a green light but were run into by this vehicle going through a red light. Tesla faced no charges. Now, they do not enforce highway-only operations, so this car went off a highway where it was designed to have autopilot running, onto city streets where autopilot is not intended to be operated. Autopilot remained enabled, And even though it's a beta feature, AutoSteer is the steering part of Autopilot, Tesla faced no charges and no consequences. They've been arguing in court cases successfully that it's entirely on the driver to ensure safety, even though it's a beta testing feature. The driver faced a criminal trial. He eventually pled no contest to vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence and received probation. But this isn't done yet. Crashes are continuing to happen with multiple brands of automated steering, and the question remains open: how much, if any, exposure the company should have to the bad consequences of crashes? This is especially problematic when the system is designed in a way that it is reasonably expected that people have trouble managing safety due to automation complacency and other factors. Thus far, the attitude seems to be that the human driver is expected to be perfect, which humans aren't, and they're expected to be able to do beta testing without special training, which they don't have, and if something bad happens, it's entirely on the driver. The takeaway is that blaming drivers protects the company pretty well, but does not necessarily protect other road users. Lots of sensors means that autonomous vehicles will have no avoidable crashes. So the fact we have sensors means they'll see things and they would never hit something that's physically possible to avoid. That's a myth. The way robotaxis and other autonomous systems work is that they have a perception system that builds a world model. The real world is out there, and some sensors sense that real world. There may be video cameras, probably multiple of them. There's a LiDAR, which is like a light-based radar that some vehicles have, and there's actual radar. All those things have different views of the world. They have different strengths and weaknesses. They have different capabilities. A typical robotaxi, for example, will have all of these modes of sensing and maybe some more. They take all those inputs, and then they use a machine learning-based system to run a perception system which says, okay, that camera image coupled with that LiDAR image, coupled with that radar image, means that there's a child kicking a ball out in the middle of the road. And they build a world model saying, yep, sure enough, there's a child chasing a ball into the street 10 meters ahead. Okay, that's important. Now what do? Well, we have a path planning and motion control with some prediction that says anytime there's a ball going into the road with a child in proximity, we're going to assume the child is going to chase the ball and we're going to stop whether or not we see the child right now, because we know that the ball is going to be followed and we want to avoid getting into a bad situation in the first place. Or less aggressively, oh look, there's a child on the road, I think we need to stop. This works if you actually take the video and LiDAR and radar and realize that it's a child and not a picture of a child or not a bush or not something else. So while you can have a lot of sensors, the real magic is happening in the perception and prediction to turn that sensor image into a model of what's really happening in the world. You'll hear some companies say we're safe because we have lots and lots of sensors, and our sensors don't blink, and they see 360 degrees all the way around the car, and they see all these things, and that can be true, but that does not necessarily mean they're safe. Sensors is only the first part, as you just saw. Once you have a camera image and a LiDAR image and a radar image, then you do sensor fusion, which is, well, the camera sees this and the radar sees this and the LiDAR sees this. They're all presenting somewhat different images. What's really going on? The sensors might disagree. They might have different opinions as to what type of object it is. But the idea of sensor fusion is to take all those sensor inputs and say, okay, there's a thing there based on this sensor information. And if the sensors disagree, you have to figure out which ones to believe and which ones not to believe. And maybe you get that wrong. Then there's perception and prediction. Okay, I see a thing there. Is it a child? Is it a bush? Is it a shadow? Is it a picture of a child? What exactly is it? And there is a non-zero misclassification and misprediction budget here. These systems are not perfect at classifying objects, especially in between objects, like a person walking next to a bicycle might be a person on a bicycle. It might be a person riding a bicycle, which have different behaviors and therefore will have different predictions of what happens next. What if there's a planning control fault? You might have perfect sensor fusion and perfect perception prediction, and your planning logic just gets it wrong. Yes, that can happen. In March 2023, a robotaxi hit the back of a city bus, and there were no extenuating circumstances. There was no reason for it to do that. It saw the bus. The sensors all saw that there was a bus there as far as we know. And the explanation was, well, the tracking logic said, I see a bus, and this particular bus had a joint in the middle. It was articulated. And the tracking logic decided to follow the front half of the bus and basically ignore the back half of the bus that was right there. And so it ignored the back half and it ran into it. Simple as that, straight up logic defect, to the point that a recall was issued in April to correct that defect. The moral of the story is just because a sensor's there and the car sees the object does not mean it will do the right thing. Cars have software. Software has bugs. Automated vehicle software will have bugs that hopefully are eliminated before volume production, but that's a possibility that can't be ignored. The takeaway is that sensors are important, sensors are great, but sensors aren't enough. Perception and prediction are also critical for safety. Computers won't drive drunk. Truth or myth? Well, this one's misleading. It's a little bit of both. It may be that computers won't drive drunk, but that doesn't mean that they'll be perfect drivers. The problem is that when you remove human drivers from vehicles to make a fully autonomous vehicle, indeed, you're removing human error from the driving task because there's no person, but you are introducing robot error. Robots aren't perfect either. Here's an example from August 2023 of a robotaxi driving into wet concrete. Now, to be clear, people do this too. There's some entertaining videos on YouTube of people driving into wet concrete. And I say entertaining because people typically don't get hurt. It's just super embarrassing. So this isn't saying that humans are perfect. What it's saying is just because a human isn't there does not mean the robot won't make exactly the same mistake. In August 2023, a robotaxi had a crash with a fire truck. Now, what was happening here was the robotaxi had a green light at an intersection, but there was a fire truck in emergency response mode with its sirens going and its lights on who needed to come through the intersection, and the robot driver failed to yield as required. Now, do people make this mistake? Indeed, people do make the mistake, but the point is the robotaxi made the mistake too. So saying we're going to get rid of human error does not mean that you will have perfect driving, because robots have driving errors too. The issues with potential misbehavior go beyond traditional crash scenarios. Here's an example in March 2022 where not one but two robotaxis went through an emergency scene where there was yellow tape. You can see the yellow tape in the picture where there's some down power lines from the municipal transportation system. These lines happen to be de-energized, but if they'd been energized and if there'd been passengers in the vehicle, there could have been an electrocution fatality. Fortunately, there were no passengers, and fortunately, the lines were de-energized. But these vehicles ran right through emergency response scene tape, dragging the tape and the wires behind it. And it wasn't just one car, a second robotaxi followed the first one through. The important point here is there are things other than crashes with other road users that are critically important for safety, and all of these things have to be accounted for. Now again, could a human driver have made this mistake? I'd like to think it would be kind of unusual for a human driver to make this mistake, but sure, it could happen. The point isn't that human drivers are perfect. The point is that robotaxis won't be perfect either. The city of San Francisco had some concerns with robotaxis from both Waymo and Cruise in 2023. They saw issues such as obstructing emergency response vehicles en route, intrusion into response zones, unpredictable operations near response zones, contact or near miss with equipment or hoses. One of them was trying to run over a fire hose, for example, and blocking the fire station by immobilizing themselves in the fire station driveway, and so on. The issues here are a little more specific to robotaxis. I'm going to say that a human driver who has a firefighter or a police officer screaming at them to move the vehicle is probably going to move the vehicle. But screaming at a robotaxi turns out doesn't work. It just sits there until a remote response unit can do something, and sometimes that involves having someone drive out to be able to move the robotaxi. The number and type of incidents created significant concern with the city of San Francisco regarding robotaxi impact on emergency response operations. Safety goes beyond just avoiding crashes. Here's a scenario from August 2023. In this case, a robotaxi was making a left turn rather than going straight through, and the road happened to be closed. Halfway through the left turn, it stopped, and then noticed it was aligned with an open lane in the road closure and decided to go through anyway. You can see there's a flag holder there and a high-vis vest. There's some road closed signs. There's some do not turn signs. There's plenty of signage indicating the entire road is closed. There was a lane open probably for construction vehicles, for example. It's clear from context. Any human driver would have said, oh yeah, that road is closed. I shouldn't go there. But this robotaxi decided to go for it anyway. Fortunately, no one was hurt. But does that make this safe? I'm going to say probably this was unsafe behavior. Human drivers are imperfect. They drive drunk, they drive under the influence, they drive tired, they drive distracted. They sometimes, on occasion, aggressively violate road rules. Yeah, that's right, we all know human drivers aren't imperfect. But just because we take out the humans does not mean the robot drivers will be perfect. They're going to have their own failure modes as well, some of which are going to be the same as humans, perhaps for different reasons, and some will be uniquely inhuman failures. They're going to have software defects, and those software defects are going to cause them to misbehave. Now, we hope the number of software defects is low, but saying you have perfect software the first go just isn't a thing. It's not going to happen. There will be software defects. We have to expect them. We have to take extraordinary engineering measures to make sure that they are few in number and low in impact. These vehicles will be challenged by subtle context. Yes, there are a bunch of road closure signs, but there's a lane open. Does that mean you can drive on that lane? No, you should know from context that that's for construction vehicles, even though there's not a sign saying this lane for construction vehicles. Ordinary drivers had a lot of understanding of how the world works, and these systems based on machine learning struggle with that when they encounter a situation they haven't seen before. They're unable to reason about the missing pieces. They're also challenged by rare events for that same reason. If they see something novel, they don't know how to respond because they've never been trained to do that. There are also potential errors in building the model of the external world. If their perception and the building of the world model is inaccurate, what they think is going on isn't what's really going on. And that can lead to errors that a human driver would say, well, that's just a stupid error. That makes no sense at all. The reality behind it is there's some combination of the robot built a wrong world model because it was seeing things it didn't know how to handle, and then it responded with what it thought was the right response, but based on lack of training or lack of exposure to the scenario, it was sort of choosing an arbitrary response from its library that didn't match a situation that probably it didn't really understand. There are also potential errors by remote human operators. In this case, and this is pure speculation, it could have been that a remote operator said, oh, I see a lane, don't worry, go for it, without necessarily noticing the road was closed because of a bad camera angle or who knows what. Just because the remote operators doesn't mean they will get it perfect either. What you have is a combination of a robot that could be struggling in unusual situations, and it has to know to ask for help instead of just doing its own thing without help. And even when it asks for help, there'll be a non-zero failure rate of that remote help. All of that has to be taken into account. Now, this doesn't mean that robotaxis are necessarily more dangerous than human drivers. They might still be safer. It just means you cannot argue, well, there's no human, therefore they'll be perfect, because it's pretty clear that's not how it's going to turn out. The takeaway is that robot drivers will fail, sometimes the same but sometimes differently than human drivers. Safe enough requires more than just being safer than a human driver. Truth or myth? This one's true, but the reasons why it's true are a lot more complicated than simply people want it to be safer. To understand this, first, let's talk about what do people actually mean by safe for an autonomous vehicle? Well, you could say human drivers are bad, so computers will be safe, but that's not necessarily true. That's just an intuitive argument that comes from people, I guess, who've never seen a computer failure. I'm not sure who those folks are because computers fail all the time, but intuitively, humans are bad, so computers will be safe is an argument you hear. Some companies say safety is our #1 priority, but that's really just a slogan. Some folks say safe driving behavior and good roadmanship is enough to make you safe. Well, that's part of the story. But they also say that you tested and simulated for millions of miles, and that proves safe driving behavior and roadmanship. Well, millions of miles of testing is good, but it's not near enough. They may say, well, the risk is managed by insurance. We have an insurance policy, so we must be safe, or the insurance company would not have given us a policy. Well, that's only partly true. There's a lot more to safety than just that. They'll say, we conform to safety standards. Conforming to safety standards is a great thing, but how you conform and whether you're using the right safety standards also enters into it. They'll say that they have a safety case, an argument that shows that they're safe, supported by evidence. That's really great to hear, but you need to do other things as well. And they'll say we have positive risk balance. We're a better driver than a human. While you may hear all of the above things, safety in most discussions usually boils down to the intuitive notion that, well, we're safer than a human, so that must mean we're safe enough. Let's take a look at that argument about we're safer than human drivers, so that's good enough, because it turns out in reality you probably need more than that. Positive risk balance is a name given to the concept of safer than human driver. The idea is that your risk is lower than that posed by a human driver, so that's a justification to be out on public roads. Sounds good. I mean, we're better than a human. What do you want from us? Well, it turns out that nailing down what that even means is difficult, and as we'll see in later slides, there's actually more to it than that. If you want to say we're safer than human, you have to say which human? Do you want to be safer than the 28% who are alcohol impaired, driving under the influence, causing fatalities? That means if you look at all the crashes involving human drivers as a baseline, more than a quarter of them involve alcohol use. Do you want to include those in your baseline? How about the speed-related, the distracted, the drowsy? So do you want to be better than an average human with all these bad behaviors that you said you wouldn't have? Or do you want to be better than a human driver who's not indulging in these behaviors? Also, what age? People say old drivers are bad. The data doesn't show that. In fact, a 60-year-old driver is 3.5 times better than a 16-year-old. So do you want to be better than a 16-year-old, better than an average that includes some 16-year-olds, or better than a mature 60-year-old driver who has excellent judgment? Where and who also matters. There's 3.4 times the fatality per vehicle mile based on which state you're in. Some states are pretty safe, some are pretty scary. Are you going to match your driving safety with the state you're in? If you're operating in a safe state and use the national average, that's basically giving you an unfair advantage and makes you potentially more dangerous than all the vehicles around you because you're driving national average in a state that happens to be quite safe. There's also victim demographics. If you have more pedestrian fatalities than other drivers, you could have a net safer outcome and still have a problem. Also, which vehicle? New vehicles have active safety, but the average car age in the US is now 12 years old and does not have all the fancy active safety features. If you have a robotaxi equipped with amazing active safety features, it's not fair to compare it against a 20-year-old economy car. You should be comparing it against new cars with comparable active safety features that do not have automation enabled. There are other safety considerations. You have to consider whether you're having risk transfer onto vulnerable populations. What if the total number of fatalities goes down, but the number of vulnerable road users, pedestrians and so on, doubles? You could have fewer total fatalities and yet increase the risk to vulnerable populations. While you can say that's safer than a human driver on average, that's probably going to be an issue because there are particular segments of the population there that are bearing the brunt of increased harm. You could say, well, you should also avoid negligent driving behavior. If you're intentionally breaking traffic rules and that leads to crashes, then that's not going to be okay, even if your net safety is better. You want to look at fine-grained regulatory control of risks. Recalls are not about average safety typically. They're about specific bad behavior. So if you have a problem, for instance, that you're running into emergency vehicles at crash scenes because the flashing lights confuse your automation system, you may have, in fact, a better net safety record, but you keep hitting emergency response vehicles and injuring emergency responders. That's not going to be okay. That's not going to be acceptable safety, regardless of the average safety of your system. There are also ethical and equity concerns. What if some demographics are at increased risk? What if some folks, based on skin color or clothing type or where they live or mobility aids, who knows what if they're at dramatically increased risk because your automation is poor at dealing with them? That's also going to be a problem even if your net safety is improved compared to average human drivers. Eventually, there'll also be crash-by-crash comparisons. Regardless of net safety, regardless of having addressed all the other issues, there will be instances in which it's asked if a human driver would have made that same mistake. And if the human driver would not have made the mistake, that's going to look bad for the technology, regardless of net safety and better than human driver on average. So it may be relevant sometimes to ask, is it better than a human driver on a crash-by-crash basis? Overall, you're going to need more than improved statistical average safety for people to believe that your robotaxi or other autonomous vehicle is actually safe enough to be deployed on public roads. Insurance cost pressure will ensure acceptable automated vehicle safety. Truth or myth? This one's a myth. The question is how much leverage insurance costs have over safety in practice. Let's take a look at the industry to see how this works. In 2020, there were $1.35 billion in insurance losses. Now, the premiums paid are a bit higher than that, but this gives an idea of the actual cost of having losses for conventional vehicles in the United States in that year. These can be broken down across things that involve harm to people and involve harm to property. 40% of the costs were injury and medical losses, which means 60% were things other than injury and medical losses. In the 2020 statistics, there were 2.9 trillion vehicle miles. That's a lot of miles. There were 268 million vehicles. There were 6.8 million collision claims. There were 810,000 vehicle thefts, and there were almost 39,000 fatalities. While that's a lot of loss of life and should be improved, if you look at the numbers, it's a very small number of events compared to the number of other types of claims, the number of vehicles, and the number of miles. If the cost of the fatality claims is small compared to the overall picture, then a change in fatalities will not be a really big driver in insurance premiums and insurance cost. The problem with assuming that insurance prices will force safety is that insurance isn't about safety. Insurance is about spreading the cost of risk across all the people who are driving. And a lot of that cost doesn't have anything to do with harm to people. It has to do with the cost of harm to property. Some companies will say we're safe because we bought insurance. But the issue is if you're running a fleet of 10 or 100 or even 1,000 robotaxis, it isn't that many vehicles, so that limits the exposure to bad things. And also, typical insurance company policies have a maximum payout. So if that limit is, say, $10 million, the company knows no matter what, they're only out $10 million. Well, that sounds like a lot of money. When you're insuring hundreds of millions of vehicles and trillions of miles as an industry, it's actually a very small fraction of the total payout. So the companies may issue insurance policies because they're trying to gain market share, not because they think they'll make a profit on insuring a handful of cars. Another issue with insurance is that affordable risk might exceed everyday safety. As an example, military personnel serving in combat zones and in combat roles can get life insurance that pays out even if they're killed in a military action. Most people would say that being involved in combat is not on a par with everyday civilian risk, but you can still get insurance for it. The fact that this surprisingly affordable insurance exists tells you that just because you bought insurance does not mean you're doing something safe. Insurance is about pricing risk, not about safety. While insurance companies like to promote safety, and that's a great thing, ultimately they price their policies based on the expected payouts. If customers want to do risky things, they can pay increased premiums and take those increased risks. So it's not about, hey, I have insurance, it means I'm safe. It's about the insurance company being able to predict in advance how risky the thing is you're doing and issue a policy with a premium that reflects that risk. So just because your insurance is affordable to you does not mean that the net safety from that activity is going to be acceptable. Beyond that, net risk alone is also not safety. Insurance is about the net risk. It's the number of payouts compared to the amount of premium, and as long as the premium is higher than the payouts with enough margin to run the business, the insurance companies are happy. There's also things like redistribution of harm. What if more pedestrians or cyclists die? What if more mishaps happen in historically disadvantaged areas? Those disproportionate effects to vulnerable populations are not going to be reflected in insurance premiums, which are just about the total cost of the harm compared to the total cost of the premiums. There are also negative risk externalities which don't involve insurance at all. Blocking fire trucks, blocking ambulances is unlikely to have much of a direct effect on insurance, but can definitely have an effect on things like emergency services operating in a city. And what if known significant risks are unmitigated? What if the total fatalities decrease even if there's a known defect in the software? Is that okay? Well, net risk won't reflect that situation, but there are plenty of instances in which a misbehaving robotaxi or misbehaving automated truck are going to be a problem, even if the net risk has been reduced by the technology. There are also fatalities due to breaking traffic rules. Humans break rules too, but they're held accountable via negligence. They can have civil lawsuits against them. Their insurance premiums can go up because they misbehaved. And the fact that they can still get insurance doesn't mean that they're safe drivers. It means they're paying higher premiums. So the fact that you have insurance and the fact that the insurance deals with net risk does not address all the aspects that are required to be acceptably safe. The takeaway is that insurance pressure alone will not ensure acceptable safety. More than insurance pressure is required. Autonomous vehicle ethics is all about the trolley problem. Truth or myth? This one's a myth. The trolley problem is the last thing we should be worried about when we're concerned with the ethics of deploying autonomous vehicles on public roads. To understand this, let's first talk about the trolley problem. Given a no-win situation, should the vehicle kill one person to save 5? Some people would say, well, yeah, you have fewer people dying. But other folks are concerned that if that means making an intentional decision to kill one person, maybe that's not okay. What about if you decide you're going to kill socially devalued people? Does that mean that you need to wear a suit when you're walking on public roads as a pedestrian to make sure the autonomous vehicles kill someone else instead of you? This turns out to be a false dilemma. It's not the question we should be really worried about. Here's an example from a popular online site that has people explore this. In this particular scenario, we have a car with nobody on it, so it's an autonomous vehicle with no passengers, and it has a choice of killing 2 homeless people who are walking against a red light or killing the 2 business people who are walking with a green light. And it turns out the homeless people have to meet in this path, but the question isn't, should you switch paths or not? The question is, should you kill the homeless people or should you kill the business people? Really, how often will this happen? And how does the car know that some folks are homeless? What if it's a person carrying a briefcase as protective camouflage? I mean, who knows? It's just a ridiculous question to ask in a practical sense as opposed to a theoretical, philosophical sense. And beyond that, why was this car running around on roads without redundant brakes? If it actually had brake failure, there's some really serious engineering design problems going on, and that car should not have been on the road in the first place. So it's an unrealistic scenario. And why didn't the car, there's no passengers in it, why didn't it hit one of the side barriers to roll itself over and take away its motive power if it lost brakes? Again, there's nobody in the car, it could do that. So this is a setup of a false dilemma. It may be interesting and useful to understand the variations of cultural norms of what lives are valued more than others and what situations are valued more than others. For that, it's fine. But it's not actionable and not relevant to autonomous vehicles anytime in the near future. It's going to be a very long time, if ever, before the number of fatalities in these no-win situations has anything to do with the overall fatality rate on roads. Or if it is, then that means they haven't been engineered safely in the first place. This is not the question to ask. So what is the question to ask? The number one problem in ethics of autonomous vehicles is deployment governance. Who decides when to deploy based on what? That's the question we should be worried about. You have aggressive for-profit deployments. These companies are in business to make money. Now that's okay, especially in the US. We love having businesses in business to make money, and that's okay. The question is, do they do external harm? Are they well behaved? Are they doing the right thing socially while they're trying to make their money? The issue here is they have existential financial and time pressure. This technology takes a long time to deploy. Promises have been consistently made over years that it'll be done sooner than it really is. All the companies end up under time pressure. They have to get out there and get their robots moving on public roads, possibly before they really should be doing that for safety reasons. Add to that, there's missing independent technical oversight. The US government has taken a non-regulatory approach, that's their words, and so the companies are pretty much on the honor system to be doing the right thing, at least until a crash happens, and then the regulators move in after the fact. If these companies want to do ethical deployment, they should be addressing the following at least. They should be publicly disclosing how safe they plan to be so they can be measured against whether they meet their safety objective. I did not say the government has to set a bound on exactly what that is. I just said that they should call their shot. They should say, here's our plan, here's our expectation for safety, here's our metrics, go ahead and measure us to see if we're doing what we said we did. There should be an inclusion of stakeholder concerns. All the vulnerable road users should have some way of influencing whether these vehicles go on the road in response to the risk that they're being put at by the public road testing. There should be transparency of data and processes. Right now, the industry keeps everything secret they possibly can. They say it's all trade secrets and proprietary, but when you dig down, what you find is some of the times what's really happening is they're not being forthcoming about the risks they're imposing on other road users. And also accountability for any losses. At some point, a loss will happen. That's inevitable. And roads are not perfectly safe places, so maybe it's okay for there to be the occasional loss. But the company should be held accountable and should not have a way of deflecting accountability due to favorable regulatory approaches. There are some concerns on equity as well. Ride-hailing with human drivers made a lot of promises with disappointing results. The promises were made, and it really hasn't turned out that way. In fact, some of the reasons why people really want robotaxis are because the ride-hail companies didn't deliver. For example, disabled folks say the ride-hail drivers will have troubles picking them up. They don't want them as riders, and robots clearly will pick them up. Well, why should we believe that for-profit robots will actually turn out differently? You can make the argument, but the same arguments were made with ride-hail. That didn't work out. So we don't really know how this is going to turn out with robot drivers either. There are labor concerns. There's concerns about displaced ride-hail and taxi drivers. There's concerns about displaced truckers. And this technology will take a long time to mature. So I think that any concerns about instant unemployment for the entire class of drivers are not going to come to pass right away. But certainly there are concerns there that need to be addressed. There are also transportation access concerns. Will the disabled really get service in the absence of regulations requiring, for example, common carrier type rules to serve all folks? And there's an issue that cheap taxis can pull traffic away from public transit, which is safer. So even if robotaxis are just as safe as human-driven vehicles, the fact that they're putting more people in taxis instead of on trains and buses can reasonably be expected to cause a net reduction in traffic safety by switching to less safe modes. There's also risk distribution concerns, that testing risk might be imposed on a vulnerable population unless there are rules limiting that. And there's a municipal preemption clause in most cities with this testing, which says that the local government cannot control issues that happen, and that needs to be addressed. The takeaway here is that the ethics and equity question we should be worried about is who decides what, when, and where to deploy. The trolley problem is not the thing we should be spending our time worrying about. 10 million good miles has proven autonomous vehicles are safe. Truth or myth? This one's a myth. In 2023, 2 companies published results from their first million autonomous driverless miles. Waymo published a 1 million mile rider report in February 2023, and Cruise published one in September 2023. And both of them claimed that they were safer than human drivers. In both cases, the emphasis was on at-fault crashes. They're looking at crashes saying, well, if the other human driver caused the crash, we're not going to count that one. We're only going to look at crashes that we caused, which is only part of the story for road safety. Another part of the story is avoiding crashes. Maybe the other person did something wrong, but did you avoid it? And the two companies do talk about that. Waymo certainly talks about that more. In September 2023, Waymo came out with a report done in cooperation with Swiss Re Insurance Company based on 3.8 million miles. And what they claimed was safer than human-driven vehicles, and they said there are 100% fewer bodily injury claims, meaning no bodily injury claims. So the claims being made here are that based on 1 to 3 or 4 million miles, they're seeing fewer low-severity crashes. We're seeing no bodily injuries. We're seeing fewer fender benders, and therefore we're safe. Now, an interesting note is that this Waymo report in September 2023 ended its data study period the day before there was a passenger injury in a Waymo robotaxi, and it's unclear how that would have affected the outcome of the study if they had included one more day of data. How many road testing miles? Well, Waymo, as of the time this is recorded, claimed that they have tens of millions of miles, 40 million miles, and that includes both robotaxi operational deployment with no test driver, but also test driver miles is my understanding. Okay, tens of millions of miles. That sounds impressive. It's 80 times to the moon and back. That sounds like a lot, and it's meant to impress us with how many miles. But the question is, how many miles is that compared to what you really need to know for fatalities? Because the companies are saying they're going to reduce fatalities. Fatalities is the metric they keep pushing. It's about saving lives. So we should judge them on how far are they to prove they're saving lives. Well, let's look at the data. Human drivers run 79 million miles to 98 million miles between fatal crashes. And it depends which year you look at. So that's just under 100 million miles between fatal crashes. That includes all the drunk, impaired, speeding. If you look at unimpaired, non-speeding drivers, the number's actually a lot higher, more than 100 million miles between fatal crashes. If you want to be statistically as good as an average human driver, including the misbehaving drivers with 95% confidence, you need between 237 million and 294 million vehicle miles with no fatalities to prove you're at least as good. So 237 to 294 million, and they have 40 million. That's where we are now. So they're nowhere near having enough miles to prove statistically that they're actually on a par with or reducing fatalities. But the problem with this plan is that at 250 million miles, give or take, if you only have 100 million miles between crashes, you've probably had 1 or 2 crashes. So you need even more miles for the statistics to average out. Rule of thumb, about 10 times as many miles. And so you're talking something like 1 billion miles, and they have 40 million. Now, Waymo, to its credit, in their 7.1 million mile report says no statement can be made regarding serious injuries and fatalities. And they're absolutely right, because they don't have the 1 billion miles. So to the degree they say, we think we're safer on low severity events, and we think we're on track for fatalities and on track for severe injuries, but really we don't know how it's going to turn out, that would be a complete statement. But what do they really say? What they're saying often lacks nuance, and the nuance really matters here. Robotaxi companies have been predicting acceptable safety for a while, based on non-severe crash rates that then extrapolate to see how it would turn out for severe crashes and fatalities, sometimes with controversial limitations to the study. Right now, what Waymo has on its page is that their safety philosophy is that they're already reducing traffic injuries and fatalities. Okay, so maybe they're reducing low severity injuries, but the serious injury rates and the fatality rates are predicted because they simply don't have enough miles to know how it's going to turn out. Now, they can really believe in their predictions, they believe in their methodology, and that's great. I certainly hope it turns out to be true, but we don't have the miles. Nobody has the miles to know whether their predictions are true or something's going to arise that they did not predict that's going to cause a problem. We need 300 million miles or more, possibly up to 1 billion miles, to confirm whether driverless robotaxis will be as safe as even average human drivers. And we have maybe 5 to 10 million miles driverless now per company, with continually evolving software. And there's a question as to whether or not you reset the odometer every time there's a software change. The reduced fatality rates are still aspirational. The companies are confident they're on a path. That's great. I certainly hope they get there. But it's a little early to claim victory because we have a few 100 million more miles to go before we see how it really turns out and to see what safety issues that could lead to fatalities they did not consider in their analysis. The unknown unknowns are the issue here. Declaring safety victory at this point is sort of like running a marathon. You've run a mile, you're beating your splits, you're on track for the world record marathon, but you're only 1 mile in. There's a bunch more miles to go and lots of things can go wrong in those miles. That's where we are with robotaxi safety now. The takeaway is that companies predict but cannot yet prove severe injury fatality safety. We're going to have to wait quite a lot longer to know how that really turns out. Road testing makes autonomous vehicles safe. Truth or myth? This one's a myth. Road testing is not enough to make them safe. Let's explain why. Well, let's start with the basic robot driver test. Let's pretend this is an ordinary human driver who has to go through the testing process to get their license. They do a vision test and they do some other stuff. And then they do a written test to make sure they know about the traffic laws. And then there's a road test testing whether they can obey traffic laws, whether they can negotiate effectively with human drivers, and whether they can resolve some example potentially ambiguous situations. All right, let's say that a robot driver does all those things. They pass a written knowledge test of some sort. They pass a road test where they drive around for a mile or so, and the examiner says, yeah, okay, this thing knows how to drive. Does that get you everything you need for safety? Well, no. There's another much more important requirement beyond all these that is levied upon human drivers, and the question is how we do that with robot drivers. And that requirement is you have to be a 16-year-old human in most places to qualify for a driver's license. And the reason we do that is it's a proxy for maturity of judgment. Now, we can have all sorts of snarky remarks about how immature 16-year-olds are, but the fact is they've had 16 years to figure out how the world works. They can do a really good job of walking into an unstructured situation and figure out what happens next, having never seen the situation before. Beyond that, there are some maturity of judgment factors that come into play. Some of it's experience, some of it's growing up. But the baseline of a 16-year-old person to be able to predict what happens next in an unstructured situation is amazing. And this is a big thing that machine learning-based robot drivers struggle with. So we need a proxy for maturity of judgment and experience with how the world works. And it's not clear how to get that on just testing. And this is why you do not see safety-critical systems generally tested and tested and tested to prove they're safe, because it just takes too much testing. Instead, what you see is engineering rigor used as a proxy for maturity of judgment. So rather than seeing, well, can they reason well, we say, you know what, we've done a lot of engineering to make sure we've designed in all the behaviors that we need, and that's why we know they're safe. So a robot driving test doesn't prove that happen. You need something else. Now, if you don't want to go with engineering rigor, if you really, really want to go testing, what you have to do is a whole lot of testing. The reason is you need to make sure a robot driver can deal with the vast majority of the strange, unusual, rare stuff that's going to happen on the roads that's still relevant to safety. If you're looking at 100 million miles per fatality as a ballpark number, you're going to need 3 to 10 times that to get statistical significance. So we're talking 1 billion miles of testing, more or less. How much is that? Well, that's 50 times on every road in the world. That's a lot of miles, all right? It's a huge amount of driving. And by the way, you might have to start over after every software update if you can't prove that the update did not disrupt previously learned behaviors, which in fact is a problem for machine learning. If you teach it new things, sometimes it forgets old things. So this is really just a huge amount of brute force testing. It's just not practical. The challenge is covering everything. Have you covered all the possible unknowns? Have you run out of unknowns to the point that everything's pretty much nailed down, at least in the environment you intend to operate in? Here are some examples of unknowns that range from the pretty common to the crazy, but it's to give you an idea of the span of things that you might need to be able to deal with. One of them is that driving into water is tough, whether you're a human driver or a robot driver. Here's a picture of a pickup truck that drove into a puddle a little deeper than they thought it was going to be. You have to know to not drive into water unless you're really, really sure about what the depth is going to be. There's another one. Every once in a while you get a very, very complicated road arrangement. This one's called the magic roundabout. This is a pretty well-known thing, so it shouldn't be a surprise. But if you're going to drive on that road, you'd better know how to deal with this. Then you have the weird road actors. Here's a person in a chicken suit, but there are people in costumes on roads all the time, not just during Halloween, but especially during Halloween. You need to realize that this is a person and should be treated as such, and you also need to realize that the behavior of this thing is going to be more like a person than a real chicken. Then there's the truly bizarre stuff. Now you may say this is crazy, airplanes aren't on roads. Well, beyond there being a picture, I've personally experienced this. When you go on some military air bases, there are stop signs and you're not stopping for cars, you're stopping for aircraft going from the flight line out to the runway. So this is a thing. If you want to really drive everywhere, you have to deal with some really unusual things that you're sharing the road with. And then there's the things that don't seem that odd, but are actually surprisingly subtle. Here's a person and a bicycle. Now, is this person riding the bicycle or is this person standing next to the bicycle and holding it? Most people would say probably standing next to the bicycle and holding it because the feet are flat and there's one hand on the handlebars. Where's all the details in color? Well, maybe this person's backlit at sunset and that's basically all you're seeing as a shadow. People are really good at figuring out this kind of stuff. The expected speed of a person riding a bicycle is much, much different than a person pushing a bicycle than a person standing still, and those predictions are going to matter. So these are the kind of things you need to be able to deal with, and it's just a small sample. If you want to be able to drive safely in the world, you need to know not only what the things are, but what's going to happen next. And good prediction is based on a world model. You have to have good classification, and you have to have prediction based on that classification. Here's an example. Here's a person. How do I know it's a person? Well, it's something, looks like coat, looks like shoes, looks like feet on, and maybe some arms holding an umbrella. So I'm going to say it's a person, even though you can't really see that it's a person, but it sure looks like a person to me. Okay, so here's a person, and what happens next? Well, their feet are together, so it looks like they're going to stay still. And so I'm not predicting it on they're motionless, so they'll stay motionless. I'm predicting it on posture, which is what human drivers tend to do. And what happens next, though? What are the chances this person decides to cross? Because they're in a marked crosswalk, so you'd better yield. Well, right now, hard to say. Probably not going to move, but we need to keep an eye on this. But the reality is there are multiple possibilities. There is a chance this person will, for no reason, run out in front of me. Or maybe they run in front of me for a reason. Safety is limited by the heavy tail scenarios. These are things that are rare but important. The probabilities of what happens next turn out to be context dependent. So looking at this, there's fairly low risk that this person will run out in the street. But what if there's a bus pulling up across the street and then the person sort of leans forward and looks like they're in a hurry? Even if they have a red light and they're not supposed to cross, they may well run across the street to catch that bus because that's their bus and it's another half hour before the next bus comes. Those kind of subtle contexts are the kind of things that human drivers are pretty good at, and machine learning will be bad at unless it's been taught about these specific scenarios. But this is a high-risk scenario. This is a scenario where you can reasonably expect a pedestrian in a marked crosswalk, mind you, will run out in front of you even though they have the don't walk sign because they're worried about missing their bus. This is the thing that happens. And if you want acceptable safety, these are the kind of things you're eventually going to have to deal with to get there. Safety lives in the rare cases. Rare cases with unusual context are ultimately going to determine whether this technology is as safe as it needs to be or more dangerous than a human driver, even if not crazy dangerous. More generally, the concern is that there will be a lot of surprises that the machine learning has to learn, and there may be lots of surprises as not just a long tail, but a heavy tail. So let me explain the difference. In a typical distribution, people love to assume random independent arrival events, so it's an exponential curve. And the idea is you test for a while, and eventually you test so much you've seen almost everything. You have almost all the area under the curve. And the things you've not seen in testing are so infrequent that you can say, we'll roll the dice. We'll still be 10 times, 100 times safer than a human driver. And so it'll be unfortunate, but when we see them, we'll fix them, and we can live with that kind of outcome. And if this were really the distribution, maybe that would be okay. But there's good reason to believe that's not the distribution. the distribution seems more likely to be a heavy tail, a power law, 80-20 rule. And the idea is there are fewer things that are common and many more things that are very rare. So it's not how often a thing happens that's rare, it's how many rare things there are to happen to you. And the difference is really important. And on the next slide, I'll do a different example to really bring that home. But here, the problem with this, if you have a power law arrival rate of the types of surprises as opposed to how many surprises arrive, that takes all the difference between those two curves and throws it out to the long tail. That makes it heavy tail, which means you have a ton of things you have to deal with, and they're all individually rare. So let me give you a concrete example to explain that somewhat theoretical graph. Let's say that you're going to do 1 billion miles of validation testing. Let's say it's 1 million miles between unsafe surprises. So you have 100 surprises. So you've done all this work and you aren't quite where you need to be. So you're going to test a bunch to get the last surprises, and there are going to be 100 surprises, each one at 100 million miles per surprise. So these are really rare things. You're going to say, okay, fine, I'll do 1 billion miles. I'll see each one of these on average 10 times. For sure, I'll notice a few of the times, if not all 10, and I'll fix them. Okay, great. Then you're notionally perfect. This is a hypothetical example. I just picked some numbers. Let me contrast this with a different situation, because example 1 is probably not how it's going to really work. Example 2 is based on the notion that there's a lot of really weird things out on the road. How often do you see a house that looks like this mounted on top of a car? I've never seen one in person, but there's a picture, so it exists. Okay, let's say there's a ton of weird things, and nobody has seen them all. That looks more like this. It's a heavy tail distribution. Instead of 100 surprises, there's 100,000 surprises. And again, I'm just picking a number to illustrate. Well, for it to happen 1 per million miles, that means it's 100 billion miles per surprise. So there's a huge number of things, each of which is extremely rare. And you can say, well, 100 billion miles, why should we worry about it? Well, you should worry about it because one of them is happening every million miles. The problem is, if you fix each one as it happens, it doesn't do you any good. Because after 1 billion miles, you've only fixed 1% of the problems. 99% of them are still there. And the things you fixed, you probably won't see for another 100 billion miles. So the drive around and fix stuff stops working when you get out into the heavy tail. And that's the concern. The concern is that this technology, based on machine learning, only learns when you have examples to feed it. And the limit to safety is going to be how often and how many different types of weird things there are, where you just sort of hit a wall that you're just not able to predict the next surprise that's going to happen because they're so rare, but there's so many you can't ignore them, but you also can't predict them. That's the concern. So how does this fit with safety engineering? Well, here's how safety engineering works, and we'll get to why this is a problem for safety engineering. The way safety engineering works is you identify the hazards. Here's all the things that can go wrong. You determine the risk from hazards. Some things that can go wrong kind of don't matter, and some things that can go wrong are a big deal. And you apply engineering rigor in proportion to the risk presented. And the really risky things, you apply a lot of engineering rigor to make sure you mitigate the risk. And the things that aren't risky, you don't worry about, or you do minimal amount of mitigation because they don't matter. And you repeat until you have an acceptable remaining risk. So you go out and you find all the hazards, and you decide which ones need mitigation, you mitigate them, and when that process settles and you stop finding new hazards, you're done. The open challenge is, if you have a heavy tail distribution, maybe you never stop finding hazards, and maybe you have a steady stream of high-risk hazards. We don't know how that's going to turn out. We hope that over time, the high-risk hazards will dwindle to the point that the remaining risk is acceptable after mitigation, but we're still in that process. That's why years later, these cars are still running around finding new things to fix. We don't know how long that's going to take. And until that settles down, it's going to be difficult and probably too risky to go to really big scale. A different way to go is to apply really good engineering practices to get the machine learning safe without all this testing, but we don't know how to do that. We're still working on that. And finally, we have these questions about how much and what type of remaining risk is acceptable. That gets into the discussion of, well, how safe is safe enough? And so if you have an answer for how safe is safe enough, you then have to map that into the safety engineering to know how far into the heavy tail you need to get to really solve this. So it's a complicated problem, and there's a reason why this has taken years and years and years, and the heavy tail distribution is a big part of that. What's the takeaway? Safety depends on engineering to mitigate rare, high-consequence events. A takeaway that's just as important is that heavy tail distribution of surprises is a challenge to scalable deployment. Safety standards don't exist, and/or safety standards would stifle innovation if used. Truth or myth? Both of these are myths. Let's start out with the fact that safety standards for autonomous and automated vehicles do actually exist. There's more standards being created, to be sure, but there's a basic core of standards that exist and can be used right now. Let's take a quick tour through them. First, there's the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard and the New Car Assessment Program, NCAP. FMVSS and NCAP are existing standards that apply to ordinary everyday cars. Those also apply to autonomous vehicles. The brakes have to work, the airbags have to work, crash safety has to be there, and so on. So those don't go away. There are also cybersecurity standards, SAJ 3061 and 21434, that apply to computer security for all cars, and they apply to automated and autonomous vehicles as well. There's a functional safety standard, ISO 26262, again, originally developed for conventional cars, but they apply to all cars. Functional safety is functional safety. If your brake computer fails, you have to have a plan for that, and it doesn't matter who's driving, whether it's a computer or a person. The brakes still have to work. Then there's the dynamic driving task, ISO 21448, otherwise called safety of the intended function, and there's some other standards existing and under development that deal with whether or not the driving task itself is safe. These originally started for automated steering control for supervised automation, but they're now extending their scope to include autonomous vehicles as well. These standards have been out for a while too. And then there's ANSI UL 4600, which is a standard specifically designed for autonomous cars at first, and then the third edition does autonomous heavy trucks as well. So this entire stack of standards can apply to any autonomous vehicle. On top of that, ANSI UL 4600 talks about how to organize a safety case to demonstrate that you're safe. And there's another standard, SAJ 3018, which is specifically about road testing safety drivers. All these standards exist. All of them are applicable to any autonomous vehicle out on the road right now. Right now, only FMVSS and NCAP are required. The rest are optional, and there are few, if any, companies that claim they're following most or all of these. Well, why wouldn't companies follow those standards that, by the way, those are industry standards. Industry folks wrote them. Industry folks voted on them. Those are industry standards. Why would they not follow standards? Well, the typical reason is that somehow they don't apply, but that's just not true. Or that somehow they're going to stifle innovation. Oh, we can't follow standards and regulations because they will stifle innovation. You've heard that so many times. Well, let's look at the reality of that claim. Do safety standards mandate particular technology? No, they don't. They require using engineering rigor to show safety the same as safety is done in other industries. They don't say you have to use a LiDAR, and they do not say your LiDAR has to look so far. What they say is you're going to have a plan for what sensors you're going to use. You're going to have to show that the sensors can see what they need to see, and you have to have a plan for what happens when one of the sensor fails. That's pretty much where the standards go. And if you don't have those plans, then you're probably not safe. Another claim is that safety standards limit the ability to test prototypes. No, we can't test, we can't innovate because the standards are tying our hands behind our back. Well, that's not true either. Those standards apply to public road deployments of the technology. They do not apply, with one exception, to road testing. The one exception is J3018, which is not about the technology at all. It's about making sure your test drivers are trained. Do the safety standards limit ability to road test? Well, yeah, J3018, if you conform to it, says that you should use trained safety drivers, not retail customers, but trained drivers. And it says you should have test plans so you actually know what you're doing with testing and you have an organized approach. If you're not doing either one of those, you're not really testing safely. You're just messing around on roads. And they also, if you use ISO 26262, that will tell you that the big red button to turn off the autonomy has to really work when you press it. I've seen that be a problem. Following that standard is a good thing. It's not particularly onerous because you're just talking about the ability to turn off the autonomy. It's not actually covering the autonomy itself. So that's not a lot of limited ability road test, and probably that's a really good thing to keep the road testing safe. The burden from following safety standards when you're testing innovation approaches is minimal. There can be exemptions for FMVSS, NCAP doesn't apply until you produce a car, and so on. Really, there's nothing in these standards that gets in the way of testing and demonstrating and proving in an engineering sense that your innovation is going to be ready for deployment. Then there's a lot of work to make it safe, but if you're going to sell cars to the general public, yeah, you really need to be safe. And every other industry follows their own standards to get safety. The car industry should do that as well. It's important to remember that when you take out the safety driver, that's not testing anymore. That's deployment. It may be a pilot deployment, it may be a limited scale deployment, but you're putting a machine on public roads that can put other road users at risk. That's a deployment. As a case study in understanding why safety folks generally think about it this way, let's look at the loss of the Titan submersible. There was a catastrophic implosion of this submersible with a loss of 5 people aboard in 2023. This submersible, unlike other submersibles which are made out of metal, was made out of composite materials. It had unorthodox construction techniques and did not submit the design to external reviews. Well, why did they not follow the usual safety practices? Well, the developer had an attitude that real-world testing is the only thing that matters and that regulation kills innovation. These are the two things you kind of hear from the autonomous vehicle crowd, that without real-world testing, you don't know what the answer is, and that we can't have regulation and we can't have standards conformance because that'll kill innovation. And here's what the founder of the company who perished during the implosion said, that real-world testing is what you need. Having an outside entity brought in, sort of a regulator or an independent assessor, is anathema to rapid innovation. So that's why they didn't have outside eyes. And that the commercial sub-industry had not innovated because they have all these regulations. Well, it turns out that if you have regulations and you have outside checks and balances, that isn't really going to impede innovation of tests. It will impede deploying unsafe systems with people other than the developers put at risk, which is what happened here. 5 people died, 4 of them were passengers. The takeaway is, safety standards exist to deter unsafe innovation. That's not the same as deterring innovation. You can innovate all you want in the engineering side of things, but when you're deploying and imposing risk on other road users, you need to be following the safety standards to make sure you're not putting other road users at undue risk. Government regulation will ensure safe vehicle automation. Truth or myth? This one, well, it depends how you look at it, and we're not sure how that turns out. Here's an example of the robotaxi regulatory system in action. In October 2023, there was a crash in which a human-driven vehicle hit a pedestrian. That pedestrian was deflected into the path of a robotaxi, which then ran over the person. Okay, you can say at that point that it was unavoidable. There's an interesting discussion to be had, but let's continue on with what happened next. What happened next is, after the robotaxi came to a complete stop, it paused for a fraction of a second and then decided to do a pullover maneuver with the pedestrian entrapped beneath it, dragging the pedestrian, causing serious injury. So the robotaxi dragged the person after an initial stop, which is clearly a dangerous thing to be doing. And in principle, this could have been avoided because the vehicle could have remembered it ran over a person that it couldn't find. And in fact, the legs of the pedestrian were sticking out and visible in a camera field of view during the dragging part of the incident. This is a horrific mishap. What happened next? Well, the company talked to the regulators, and there's allegations on both sides about what was said and what wasn't said. But eventually, the regulators decided to suspend the operating permits in October 24th. So we're talking 3 weeks later or so. And then a couple weeks after that, NHTSA published a recall for the post-collision response to fix the issues. The illustration of this is that the regulatory system wasn't there to prevent the mishap. The regulatory system was there to investigate what happened in the mishap, to see if the company had answers and to publish a recall to fix the problem. So the regulators right now are concentrated on reacting to bad things that happen on the road much more than proactive validation of the computer drivers before they go on the road. That's how our regulatory system is intended to work in the US. So the US regulatory posture is at the federal level is they're primarily reactive via recalls. Now, there was a proposal in 2020 to require the industry to use industry standards, but that one's been stalled since December 2020. They started collecting so-called SGO, Standing General Order, crash data in 2021, which has given them data and crash reports, which they didn't have before, which is great. But all of this is reactive. The companies go out, they operate, something happens, it gets reported, and then the federal level NHTSA decides what to do about it. This is in keeping with the stated U.S. Department of Transportation regulatory posture, which is, and I quote their words, non-regulatory. So they're not doing advanced evaluation, they're taking a reactive stance. What's happening at the states? Well, this is putting a lot of the burden to grant permission on the states. But many of the states aren't really equipped with the knowledge and ability to regulate technology that's this complicated in the absence of federal proactive regulation. And so what they do is largely administrative. There are some groups in some states that are trying to be technologically savvy, but they're struggling. They just don't have the resources to be that proactive against an industry that is spending tens of billions of dollars. But what they do depends on the state. Texas, Arizona, and states like that are more or less just open for business. Come, do your testing, take out your insurance policy, fill out some light paperwork, and we'll see how it goes. California has a stronger permitting and licensing requirement, but ultimately, if you can operate for a while without causing any crashes, you'll get a permit, and then they see how it goes from there. California has a quirk that it's impossible to ticket a robotaxi because traffic tickets can only be given to human drivers, not to robots. And so there's still a lot of loose ends to be cleaned up across the states. They're struggling because states were never really meant to regulate equipment, and computer drivers are a piece of equipment, but they're also a driver, so it's kind of messy how that's all going to work out. And the reality is the company's doing more or less what they want with very little technical oversight until after something bad happens. At the municipal, city, town level, there's just a lot of frustration. And the reason for this is that the states have passed municipal preemption laws. The industry has gone around state by state saying that, well, if you don't do this, we're not going to come to your state and spend money and create jobs, etc. So you need to prevent the cities from having any say in robotaxi testing and deployment. We can do whatever we want, only the state has a say. And San Francisco saw how that turned out. The city of San Francisco is extremely frustrated with what's been going on, but they have no power because the state controls that. So the U.S. regulatory posture is kind of a mess and is very permissive to the companies doing what they want to do. Even if we decide that recalls are the best way to handle this, regulatory recalls are not a great fit for novel technology. Regulatory recalls are done in response to undue risk in the small. There's a specific issue and it's informed by test-centric standards. So if it fails one of the tests designed for human drivers, that the window doesn't defrost or the tire pressure under inflation alarm doesn't sound or the airbags don't work, okay, the regulatory system's good at that. But the regulatory system struggles with judging new technology whether it presents undue risk, which is typically on a feature-by-feature basis. Recalls historically are for specific things, not net risk. We've seen that expand a little bit in the past, that there have been recalls for rolling through stop signs, but it is not a recall that your computer driver is dangerous. It's a recall for your computer driver rolls through stop signs, rolling through stop sign is bad, you have to fix that. Or for phantom braking, braking for no apparent reason, which tends to put you at increased risk of rear-end collisions. Or maybe a malfunctioning display console. So the regulatory process to date has not been this computer driver is just not safe enough. It's been this behavior, that behavior, the other behavior. And that's a very difficult way to regulate. It can feel like you're playing whack-a-mole with all these different kinds of issues that might be due to a core technology problem, but the regulators only go after specific behaviors. The regulators are struggling to predict safety outcomes in advance. So right now they're completely reactive, at least in the US. And there's reason for that. Software safety and net risk are historically beyond regulatory scope. This system was set up to deal with there's a mechanical gizmo that is failing, it's breaking, let's change it so that thing doesn't break. They never really adapted the system aggressively to deal with software. And now, once you have no human driver involved, it's all software. And so it's going to be a challenge to adapt this system to the new world. But meanwhile, these cars are out on the road already. As a couple examples of trends in system safety recalls, the issue is if you want better system safety, how do you do that? By recalling specific features. One was a recall in February 2022 for full self-driving software running stop signs. So this software was apparently intentionally programmed to roll through stop signs. And we're not talking a slow roll. We're talking faster than a person can walk. So pretty significant speed through stop signs if it thought the intersection was clear. But the rub is, what if it's wrong about that? Eventually, there was a recall to turn off the ability to roll through stop signs. It was deployed via an over-the-air update, and the deployment happened quickly. But in fact, the behavior had been out there for many months. So saying, well, it was fixed overnight, what's the problem? The problem is that the undue risk was presented for weeks or months and months, depending on the recall, before the over-the-air remedy was implemented as part of the recall process. In 2024, there was another recall about problems with autopilot driver monitoring. That recall went out. Again, it had been more than a year that the problem had been out there. Eventually, it was recalled and there was a remedy deployed. But Consumer Reports thinks that the remedy didn't really address the problem. So the industry and the regulators in particular are really struggling with system safety recalls as opposed to specific feature recalls. We're going to have to see how this goes. The takeaway is that right now we're using a federal recall-based strategy and it's struggling to deal with system-level safety. Product liability will ensure safe vehicle automation. Truth or myth? This one's a myth. Product liability is not going to get us to safe vehicle automation. Manufacturers really want product liability, meaning that you can only have the manufacturer responsible for a crash if someone can prove there's a manufacturing defect, a design defect, and so on, and that the product is proven to present undue risk. Okay, so it kind of makes sense that if there's a software defect that caused a crash without any question, that should be the manufacturer's problem. That's right, and we're not saying otherwise. But the catch is that there are going to be a lot of situations where it's not so clear, and proving the manufacturer has a product defect is going to be a little more than is plausible. As an example, Mercedes is putting out this feature called Drive Pilot. And when Drive Pilot is engaged, the driver is told it's okay to watch a movie, it's okay to play a video game on the dashboard, and so on. In other words, in Drive Pilot, Mercedes is telling the customers that it's okay to not watch the road. Mercedes is also telling journalists that they accept legal responsibility for problems while using Drive Pilot. Well, that certainly sounds like they're accepting responsibility for crashes. But if you read the details of what they're actually providing to journalists in the detailed statements, that's not what's happening here. What they're doing is they're accepting responsibility for product liability. Well, they had to accept that anyway. That's not a voluntary thing. If you sold a defective product, you have liability for that. But what they're not doing is they're not accepting responsibility for negligent driving. So we're going to get to that in a moment. But the reason product liability doesn't give us what we need is that it's very difficult and expensive to prove product liability. You might need to do analysis of the source code, and that means setting up a secure room and paying experts to go in there and look at it. It takes hundreds, if not thousands of hours. It's super painful. It's super expensive. And for a single crash, let's say some car runs a red light or some car hits a pedestrian, it's going to be so expensive, it's really infeasible to fund that kind of effort just for one crash like that. Well, people say, what about a class action where there are a bunch of cars and we say all the cars have the same defect? Well, yeah, that is a way that this typically happens. But all those class action cars have to be the same somehow. So if a company, and this goes beyond Mercedes, this is any level 3 vehicle, if a company is updating their neural network software every week, then you have to prove that 10, 20, 30, 200 weeks of cars, all with slightly different software, are all the same car for a class action. And even if you can do that, if you have some machine learning, how exactly do you reverse engineer what's in a neural net to prove it's a software defect or a training defect or a bias in the training data? This is all pretty new ground for product liability. It's really unclear how it's going to turn out, other than that it'll be really expensive. And the reality is, there are plenty of crashes where this just doesn't make sense. To be sure, there will be some product liability cases, and that'll be the right thing for those cases. But for the vast majority of crashes where you have to decide whether the human driver is to blame, the car is to blame, product liability is the wrong tool. It's a hammer when you need a screwdriver. It's just the wrong way to go. If you have a car that runs a red light and hits a pedestrian, it ran the red light, hit the pedestrian. Why does it matter which line of code or which neuron in a neural network was the fault? You know that the car did something that if a human driver had done it would be bad. So why do we need to go all this expense? We know there's a problem. Why do we have to go through all this? It just doesn't make sense. So what we should be doing is we should be minimizing the number of cases that are product liability and solving all the easy ones by something that is not a really heavy sledgehammer, something that's a little bit easier to apply and still come up with common sense, reasonable, just results. That something is tort law. The takeaway is that product liability is the wrong tool for most automated vehicle crashes. Current tort liability rules will ensure safe vehicle automation. Truth or myth? This one's a myth. I'm not a lawyer, and so I'm going to use an engineering explanation of tort law intended for engineers. Civil tort law is when you compensate a claimant who has suffered a loss. So you have to have suffered a loss. You can't sue under tort law just because something might be defective. You have to have been harmed by something proximately caused by the negligence of another party. We're not, in this case, alleging negligent design. What we're doing is we're saying that a computer-driven car behaved in a negligent way. Well, a computer is not a person, so how does that work? Well, to make that work, what we need to do is create a fictional concept called a computer driver and assign it a duty of care. So what's a duty of care? Well, a human driver has a duty of care to other road users, and if they breach that duty of care, the human driver is negligent. So you're supposed to avoid collisions you can avoid, for example. The human driver has to act as a reasonable person would act. So a reasonable person is a theoretically competent, unimpaired driver that doesn't make mistakes, but is not a super driver, not an expert. It's just a reasonable, ordinary driver. And this is done on a per incident basis. So it's not a statistical safety argument at all. It's, we have this particular crash. Here are the facts for this crash. So a human driver, did they behave as a reasonable person would behave? And if they did, they're not negligent. And if they did not, for example, if they ran through a red light and there was plenty of time to stop and there were no extenuating circumstances, well, then they're negligent. So a duty of care imposes a requirement on a human driver to behave in a reasonable, non-negligent way. And what we're proposing is to take that concept and apply it to computer drivers. The reason we want to do this is to institute more accountability than there currently is. If it's going to take hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to sue a car company for a product defect, then that's a barrier for people with just claims to recover. It compromises accountability. But if we have computer drivers have the same mechanisms for claim recovery as human drivers, then that's going to improve accountability. To do this, we're going to create a legal fiction of a computer driver. So this is necessary because a computer isn't a person. It's not even a legal person like a corporation. A computer can't hold property. It can't sign contracts. It's not a person. And we don't want to make it a person, but we have to do something. So we're going to have a legal fiction of a computer driver, and we're going to define that as a sustained automated steering of a vehicle. Any computer that does sustained automated steering, that's a computer driver. It may be doing more. It probably will be doing more. It'll probably do speed control, for example. But this is a useful threshold decision because we've known for decades that when computers start steering a car, people start dropping out. They suffer from automation complacency. It's not really a big problem with speed control, but once you take away steering, people have trouble paying attention. So that's the right way to say that computer's really driving and the person's watching. Now, that doesn't mean that the human has no obligations, but it means the computer takes the lead in driving when it assumes control of steering. And when the computer driver is steering, the manufacturer is the responsible party. So we're linking the computer to a legal person, the manufacturer, and we're making the manufacturer responsible for breaches of the duty of care. Now, to do this, the transfer of duty of care is key. We can't simply have that if there's a computer in the car, it's always the manufacturer's fault. That's not fair. All right, so what we need to do is know who's driving when. And the computer driver has the duty of care when it accepts a request from the human driver to steer. Now, the computer could say, nope, I'm outside of my operational design domain. I'm not going to accept responsibility. I'm not going to steer. But if the computer says, okay, I got it, I'm steering, it has also accepted the duty of care at the same level that that a human driver would have it. Now, that this computer driver can transfer the duty of care back as long as there's sufficient notice, and we'll get into exactly how that might happen depending on the automation mode. The computer driver should be held to the same standard as a human driver. So this means if there's a particular crash and a human driver had been driving and that human driver would have been negligent, then the computer driver should be negligent for the same circumstances. Does not mean the computer's always negligent. It just means they're held to the exact same standard we would normally hold a human driver to. Doesn't mean that they have to behave the same. So it's not a requirement to be exactly a human driver. It's just that if a bad thing happens, if harm is caused, and that's proximate to some behavior from the computer driver, then we ask, well, will we blame a human driver? Yes. Okay. We're going to blame a computer driver the same way. Now, something that's important is a large number of traffic crashes and losses are going to also have involved a breach of the rules of the road, a traffic violation. And one of the key principles that makes this pretty straightforward to apply is that if you have a loss proximately caused by a traffic law violation or involving a traffic law violation, then that's a thing called negligence per se. So if you run a red light at 30 miles an hour, as this person doing a test drive of an automated vehicle feature is doing, and that person were to crash, somebody would be negligent per se because they ran a red light and caused a crash. So that's going to take care of most of the crashes. And we're back to, look, if the driver runs a red light and they hit something, they should be responsible. And it's a question of who was really driving. And the position we take is whoever's steering is driving. And in this picture, in the video this came from, that would have been the computer. Statistical safety does not avoid negligence. This is a really important point. If you say, well, we have half as many crashes as a human driver, that's great, but it doesn't give you a free hit. Just as a human driver, if a human driver drove 1,000,000 miles and never had a crash, and then they drive through a red light and have a crash, that's not a way to get out of negligence. They're still negligent. Now, maybe if there's a criminal case, they may get a lighter sentence because they have good record or whatever, but having a good record doesn't excuse the behavior. It may affect the penalty, but negligence is negligence, and your historical record doesn't really count there. So this is a separate thing then, better than a human driver statistically. This is on a case-by-case basis. Did you behave in a non-negligent, reasonable driver way? The implications of defining a computer driver are that most crashes can now be handled by tort law. If a computer driver runs a red light, well, we judge it just like a human driver, and we don't even have to know it was in the computer's head. We don't have to analyze it. Running a red light is negligence per se, probably, and so there we are. Do we really need source code analysis? No, it ran a red light. These computer drivers should be subject to traffic tickets and negligence findings the same as human drivers in the same circumstances. One of the side effects is that this avoids overwhelming the courts with product liability. The court system is going to struggle if every single collision caused by a computer driver ends up with a product liability lawsuit. Those are very complicated. There's a lot going on there. It's way different than a relatively straightforward traffic law court case. And by putting everything into tort law, without changing the tort law, we're just going to add this definition. We don't have to rewrite the tort law. It's really going to make things a lot more efficient and I think fair. This isn't the first time someone has had to create a new legal concept for new technology. Back in the day, there were these things called electronic signatures, and people wanted them to replace pen and ink signatures, but it wasn't clear if an electronic signature actually carried legal weight or not. But no one wanted to wait the years and years it would take to sort that out. So instead, what did people say? Well, they said, let's make a law that says there's this thing called electronic signatures. Let's define what it is. And guess what? When you say signature, electronic signature, yeah, that's the signature too. Let's bring all the weight of existing law, statute, etc. to bear. And that's what we want to do for computer drivers. A computer driver is a driver and should be treated the same for tort law purposes. Now, what does this do? It puts financial pressure on companies making computer drivers to have safe driving behavior. They're subject to the same rules. The manufacturer bears the cost from unsafe driving, which is the whole point of tort law, is to incentivize safer, better behavior. Now, this isn't going to get you completely acceptable safety for a number of reasons, but it's going to put pressure on companies to go in the correct direction, and that's a good thing. So it's a start towards safety while we're waiting the years for the regulations and all the other things to be figured out. Now we've defined what a duty of care is, and we've said the computer driver might have it, but also the human driver might have it. So now we have to figure out how to assign which one of them has the duty of care when. Because if we have confusion, we haven't really fixed the problem. To do this, we need an alternative to the SAE levels to be used for regulation. We're not talking about engineering now, we're talking about regulation. To do that, we're going to use 4 modes. The first is conventional. If the human driver is continuously sustained steering, then the human driver is responsible. Now, if you have things like lane keeping assistance, which nudges you back in the lane, that's not sustained steering by a computer, that's still conventional. So we're not talking about momentary intervention being automated here. We're just talking about the human driver is steering the steering wheel. That's conventional, human driver is responsible. Next is fully autonomous. Think robotaxis and uncrewed trucks. The computer driver is steering, the computer driver is doing everything, so the manufacturer ought to be responsible for the computer driver. Why the manufacturer, not someone else? Well, the manufacturer is the party in the best position to fix safety problems that might be there. You could try and make the vehicle owner responsible, but they don't have access to the software. How are they supposed to know whether it's safe, let alone fix a safety problem? It sort of has to be the manufacturer. The third mode is testing. So this is any vehicle that is a development vehicle. It says beta or beta testing or it's pre-production. It's not a product fit for use at scale without test drivers in there. So anytime there's a product that has a click-through that says, by the way, this is beta, it's immature, it might try and kill you, our software isn't completely done, that's testing. And for testing, the manufacturer should be responsible to have a safe test plan and to qualify the test drivers, and they ought to be responsible for the performance of the test drivers. So if someone is harmed by a testing computer driver, the manufacturer should be the one to compensate that person. Now, the manufacturer may turn around and have a problem with the test driver, but let them sort it out. If you're a pedestrian and you're hit by a piece of experimental technology, you shouldn't be the one having to sort out who's responsible. It should be the manufacturer because they're ultimately the ones who put that equipment on the street. The fourth mode, this is the tricky one. It's the awkward middle. It's supervisory mode. So that's, as the icon says, there's a driver there. They're supposed to be paying some level of attention, but they're not actually steering the car. They're just supervising what's going on. This is a unification of SAE levels 2 and 3 into a single regulatory bin. And the reason that makes sense is, at level 2 or level 3, the driver is expected to pay some level of attention, and in every car and sometimes in different modes in the car, that level of attention may vary, but the driver is supposed to be there. On the other hand, the automation steering, and we know drivers are really bad at supervising automation. So by putting the primary burden on the manufacturer, we're pressuring them to design a safe system that ordinary people can operate safely, rather than saying, well, we're going to do whatever and we'll just blame the humans so we don't have to worry about safety. That's going to lead to unsafe outcomes. So here, the computer is steering, and it's probably also controlling speed and so on, but steering is the bright line difference between whether it's in supervisory mode or conventional mode, and the human's supposed to supervise. When activated, when it accepts control of steering, the computer driver accepts the duty of care, and the human role is determined by the operational concept. the manufacturer can tell the human to do whatever they want. They can say, pay attention. They can say, take a nap. But we don't really care because the manufacturer has the duty of care. And it's up to them to make sure the human's doing whatever's expected of them, which will vary depending on the vehicle and the feature. Now, the computer driver can relinquish the duty of care. So if the computer driver decides that it can't handle what's going on, in a supervisory mode, it's okay for the computer driver to insist that the person take control back. But it has to do so for one of two reasons. The first is driver monitoring violation, and the second is due to exiting the operational design domain. So in driver monitoring violation, the computer driver is responsible for monitoring that the person is as attentive as they need to be. So it's possible that if the computer driver says, hey, person, you're supposed to notice a parked fire truck in the middle of the highway, that the person might be responsible if they crash into a fire truck, but not if the person hasn't been looking at the road. The computer driver has an obligation to ensure the person's as attentive as they need to be and to alarm and put duty of care back on the driver if the person is not being as attentive as they need to be. Similarly, these systems won't work everywhere, and that's okay. But when they're not working, they have to pass control back to the human driver. They can't just keep working and then blame the human for not noticing. For example, if they don't work in rain and it starts raining, the computer should be telling the driver, hey, human driver, it's raining. I can't work in the rain. You're going to have to take control, rather than just blaming the human driver for a crash when maybe the person didn't even realize that the light mist qualified as rain. How would they know? There's an important thing here. The computer can't just dump control back in the lap of the human. There needs to be a transition time that's reasonable, and probably it has to be at least 10 seconds. Anything less than 10 seconds is probably making an unreasonable ask. It's pretty clear that in many cases it's a lot longer than 10 seconds. So the 10 seconds is not a mandatory cutoff, but rather a safe harbor. If the computer says, hey, human driver, take over, and it's been less than 10 seconds before a crash, the computer driver still has duty of care. After 10 seconds, if it makes sense in that circumstance, then the duty of care is returned to the human driver. The computer driver still has to do best effort in case the human doesn't pick up the slack, but at some point it's the human driver's fault for not regaining control. And there's going to have to be some reasonableness language given the driver monitor. If the driver was allowed to go to sleep by the driver monitor and then expected to come fully awake and regain control and process a complicated situation, that's not going to be reasonable. This is going to depend on the design concept, and ultimately this will have to be figured out by a jury. But the point is here, you have to give the driver at least 10 seconds to take over and give them warning that they need to take over, either because they've not been paying the attention they need to pay or because you're exiting the operational design domain. Defining this computer driver concept is pretty urgent. We've known for a long time that once you take over automated steering, drivers are going to have trouble paying attention. Asking a person to supervise automation, we've known for decades. We've known since the 1940s. People are terrible at that. And expecting cars to be safe, where you're asking a human to do something they're terrible at, isn't going to work out if your plan is to just blame the human. Every time you blame a human for not paying attention, that's not going to stop the next. You're just going to have crash after crash after crash, and nothing will change if there's not pressure on the manufacturers to design a system. I didn't say it had to be perfect. I didn't say the human can do whatever they want and get away with it. What I'm saying is they have to have a carefully considered human-computer interface that appropriately assigns responsibility to the driver and ensures that the system is being used as intended. Now, we could go with net risk metrics, and people will say, well, as long as it's safer than a human, maybe that's okay. But we're not going to know that for a long time. It's really hard to measure. And we're going to say, well, we have equipment regulations. Well, those are still maturing. It's going to be years before we have equipment regulations that really cover a wide variety of driving. We're just seeing the first ones of those that only cover very special cases. And net risk, saying safer than human, doesn't deal with things like what if the pedestrian fatality rate is increased even though the net risk goes down. Solutions for all these things are needed, but they're going to take time. While we wait for that, we need something to really put a check and balance in place to make sure that the cars with automated driving features being put out on the street have reasonable safety, that they're not making unreasonable demands on drivers that drivers just can't do. And defining a computer driver concept gets us there. It's compatible with what many companies are selling. What we're saying is really, it's okay to have automated steering, but your driver monitoring has to really work, and you have to enforce the design limits. That's not particularly unreasonable, and lots of companies are basically doing that right now. So we're just trying to formalize that, and we're only imposing the same requirements for negligence that human drivers already have. So we're not setting a higher bar for cars with computer drivers, we're just saying they should be held accountable to the same level. But the important thing is this will hold companies accountable for the cost of mishaps and put financial pressure on them to make sure they're only deploying automated vehicle features, regardless of the SAE level, that have reasonable safety because they're not behaving in a way that if a human driver were behaving, we would consider negligent. Based on this discussion, automated steering is the key safety attribute. When you automate steering, you expect the driver to drop out, and you have to do something other than blaming the driver from being an imperfect human, as all humans are. Net risk metrics are insufficient. Safer than human is a long-term goal. It will take years for equipment regulations to come into place. And what about risk redistribution and inequities? Solutions are needed, but it will take time, and we need something to provide a safety guardrail while we're waiting for all those heavier weight mechanisms to happen. And that safety guardrail can be done by defining a computer driver. The computer driver in which the computer is responsible for safety when it has control of steering, and it can transition control back to the human driver under defined conditions, is compatible with what many companies are selling already. It imposes the same requirements we already use for human drivers. We're not asking a computer driver to be perfect. We're merely saying that if a human driver should have been more careful, the computer driver should have been too. And if a human driver did the best that could be done, well, a computer driver will be judged by the same standard. What it does do is provide a concrete, direct way based on current legal mechanisms to hold companies accountable for cost mishaps just by adding the definition of, guess what, a computer driver, that's a driver too, all the rest of the laws apply. The takeaway is that tort law could help support safety via defining the computer driver concept. Wrapping up, let's review the essential vehicle automation safety ideas. The first is that people might say they want to be as safe as a human driver on average. That's perhaps 100 million miles per fatal crash, better for good drivers. That's an important point. You certainly would not want to be more dangerous than average drivers, including the drunks, but that's not everything you need. The next thing you need is to avoid risk transfer onto vulnerable populations. For example, pedestrian harm should not be increased even if the net harm is reduced. Protecting all the drivers but making things worse for the vulnerable road users is not going to be an acceptable safety outcome. Beyond that, you need to avoid negligent computer driving. Running red lights and stop signs is not okay, even if the computer says, it's okay, I got it, I promise that I'm never going to hit anyone doing that. It's still not okay. Because when the day comes that a crash happens, there's going to be an issue that the automated vehicle was disobeying traffic laws when a crash happened. So the traffic laws have to be observed as well, just as for human drivers. These vehicles will need to conform to industry safety standards at the point that they deploy. As soon as you pull out the safety driver, that's a deployment, and they should be conforming to industry safety standards the same as every other safety critical system, such as aircraft or trains. And finally, they need to address other ethical and equity concerns. Things such as having localities with limited authority to regulate operations responsive to their unique conditions, and making sure that manufacturers accountable for any harm they might do will put important guardrails for safety on this technology. A number of other resources are available, including videos of keynote talks, books, podcasts, writings, and even some U.S. Congressional House testimony. I hope you find these resources useful.